Hello, and welcome to Ashby's Histories for Sleep. Tonight we are going somewhere that might be the most audacious story in the entire catalogue of human ambition. Not the most famous story, not the most comfortable one, but perhaps the most staggering if you sit with it long enough to let the scales settle into you properly. We are going to the steppes of Central Asia, to a flat, wind-swept corridor of grassland that most people in the world have never seen and never thought much about. And we are going to watch, very slowly, as a boy born into that landscape with nothing to his name except a blood clot in his fist and a talent for understanding people, built the largest land empire in the history of the world. The Mongol Empire at its height covered roughly 24 million square kilometers of connected territory. To put that in terms that might actually land, it was larger than the entire continent of Africa. At its peak, the empire held about a fifth of all the land on Earth. It touched the Korean peninsula in the east. It reached the borders of Poland and Hungary in the west. It stretched from the frozen tundra of Siberia in the north to the jungles of Vietnam and the coasts of the Persian Gulf in the south. And it was all under one political authority, connected by roads and courier stations, governed from a capital in the middle of a steppe that no one had heard of a generation before. It was built in less than 100 years. It started, in a meaningful sense, with one man. And before that man was born, there was very little reason to think any of this was possible. If this is your first time here, welcome to Ashby's Histories for Sleep. The idea here is simple. History is one of the most naturally relaxing things in the world, if it is told at the right pace and with the right kind of attention. Not as a series of dates to memorize, not as a test, but as a story. The world is very old, and the things that happened in it are extraordinary, and there is something genuinely calming about sitting with that late at night when the day has finally finished with you. If you have been here before, I am glad you came back. And wherever you are watching from tonight, whether it is late in London and you cannot quite switch your mind off, or it is past midnight somewhere in Asia and the city outside is finally going quiet, or you are lying in bed in Australia or Argentina or Canada and the room around you is dark, drop your location and your local time in the comments below. Those comments build something real. A small community of people in different time zones who are all trying to do the same thing tonight, which is let go of the day and drift somewhere else for a while. Now get comfortable. Pull whatever you have around you a little tighter. The Mongolian steppe is cold at night, and the wind comes without much warning. We are going back 8 centuries. To a world before the empire existed, to the place and the conditions that made it possible. The steppe, a world before. The Eurasian steppe is one of the great geographical facts of the world. Most people, when they try to visualize it, probably imagine something like a dry plain, relatively featureless, the kind of terrain you drive through and are glad to leave behind. That image is not entirely wrong, but it misses something important about the scale. The steppe is enormous in a way that photographs struggle to communicate. It runs as an almost unbroken corridor from the plains of Hungary in the west, all the way to Manchuria in the east, somewhere between 7,000 and 8,000 kilometers of relatively flat grassland, connected by a rough continuity of climate and ecology. It is interrupted by rivers, by the occasional mountain range, by stretches of desert in the south and forest in the north. But as a living environment, a place where human beings can survive and travel and maintain a way of life, it functions as something very close to a single vast connected space. And that space rewards one thing above almost all others: mobility. You cannot farm the steppe reliably. The rainfall is unpredictable. The soil in many areas is thin. The winters are brutal in ways that settled agricultural people in the river valleys of China or Persia or Europe found difficult to fully comprehend. Temperatures on the Mongolian plateau can drop to -40 in January, and the wind that comes across the open ground carries that cold in ways that walls and roofs do only so much to resist. What you can do on the steppe is move. You can follow the grass with your animals, shifting from summer pastures in the north to winter grounds in the south, reading the season and the land well enough to keep your herds alive and your family fed. The people who developed this way of life over thousands of years built a culture around it that was more sophisticated than it looked from the outside, and that outside observers consistently underestimated. They did not have cities. They did not build in stone. Their written traditions were limited. But they had a complete and coherent way of organizing society around the particular demands of their environment, and within that environment they were formidably capable. The Mongols in the 12th century were one of several dozen tribes and confederations living on the eastern end of this corridor in the area that is now modern Mongolia. They were not the largest group. They were not the most powerful. They were cattle and horse herders, sheep herders, people who lived in felt structures called jurs, which could be assembled and disassembled in hours and carried on the backs of horses or on two-wheeled carts when the time came to move. Their diet was heavy on meat and dairy. Their political organization was based on kinship, loyalty, and the constant negotiation of who owed what to whom. Other peoples shared the plateau and the surrounding regions. The Tatars were to the east, and they were powerful, with a long history of violent interaction with the Mongol clans. The Karaites held the Central Plateau, a significant confederation whose rulers had nominally converted to Nestorian Christianity through contact with traders from the west, part of a tradition that had spread across Central Asia from the Eastern Church. The Naimans were in the northwest, also large and organized, with connections to literate Central Asian traditions. The Merkits occupied the forests and rivers to the north of the plateau. The Tanguts, a different people with their own established kingdom, held territories to the south and west. And beyond the Great Wall to the southeast lay the Jin dynasty, the Jurchen rulers who governed northern China and who had long maintained a deliberate policy of keeping the steppe tribes divided against each other, funding one group to fight another, preventing any single confederation from accumulating enough unified force to pose a real threat. That policy had worked for a long time. The history of the steppe was a history of empires rising and falling within the span of a generation or two, unable to sustain the coordination required to hold territory across the plateau and beyond. A strong leader would unite several tribes, raid the settled world to the south, extract tribute or plunder, and then die. And the thing he had built would dissolve back into competing clans almost immediately, because there was no institutional structure capable of holding it together without the personality that had created it. This was the world in 1162. Nothing about it suggested what was coming. The social structure of the steppe in this period was organized around what anthropologists call segmentary lineage, a system in which every person's identity and obligations were defined by their position within a nested hierarchy of kinship groups, from the immediate household up through the extended family, the clan, the sub-tribe, the tribe, and the broader confederation. The genius of the system was its flexibility. At any given scale, the relevant group was the one facing the relevant challenge. In a dispute between two households, the extended family was the relevant unit of solidarity. In a conflict between two clans, the entire sub-tribe might mobilize. Against an external threat from a neighboring confederation, the full tribal identity could be activated. The weakness of the system was its instability at the highest levels. The same flexibility that allowed rapid aggregation for specific purposes also allowed rapid disaggregation once the specific purpose was achieved. The economy of the steppe was, at its core, a pastoral economy built around the herds of horses, cattle, sheep, and goats that were both the primary food source and the primary store of wealth. A wealthy man on the Mongolian plateau was a man with large herds and the pasture rights and political connections necessary to maintain them through the difficult seasons. A poor man was a man who had lost his animals, whether to disease, to a harsh winter, to a raid by a rival clan, or to the kind of bad luck that the steppe produced with some regularity. The difference between wealth and poverty on the steppe could be crossed in a single bad season, which gave the social landscape a volatility that more settled agricultural societies lacked. A man who was powerful one year could be destitute the next if his herds died. A man who was destitute one year could be powerful the next if he allied himself skillfully with a rising leader and received a share of the raiding proceeds. This economic volatility shaped the political culture in important ways. It meant that personal relationships, alliances maintained through gifts and marriages and shared risks, mattered more than the formal structures of rank and position, because the formal structures could evaporate with the herds. It meant that people were skilled at reading the relative position and trajectory of the people around them, at assessing who was rising and who was falling, and making decisions about alliance accordingly. And it meant that a leader who wanted to hold a following had to keep producing results, keep distributing wealth, keep demonstrating that the investment of loyalty was returning dividends, because the moment the returns stopped, the followers started making different calculations. Into this world, somewhere near the Onon and Kurultai rivers in what is now northeastern Mongolia, a child was born. His father was Yasugai, a minor chieftain of the Borjigin clan. His mother was Hoelun, who had herself been taken from a man of the Merkit tribe by Yasugei before their marriage. The child was born, according to The Secret History of the Mongols, written down a generation later, clutching a blood clot in his right hand. This was read as a sign. Steppe cultures had rich traditions of omen reading and of finding significance in the circumstances of a birth. A child born holding a blood clot was understood to be destined for something violent and significant. Yasugai named the boy Temujin, after a Tatar chieftain he had recently defeated in a raid. Temujin. It means something close to ironsmith in Mongol, a word that evokes hardness and the working of metal into forms stronger than what existed before. What the sources tell us is what happened next. And what happened next was the first in a long series of disasters that shaped everything about who Temujin became. The boy who should have disappeared. When Temujin was somewhere around 8 or 9 years old, his father took him on a journey to find him a bride. This was not unusual. On the Mongolian steppe, marriages were negotiated early, and the process of securing a suitable match for your son was an important part of a chieftain's responsibilities. Yasugei found a girl from the Kongirad tribe, a family with a reputation for producing remarkable daughters. Her name was Borta. She was 10 years old. Yasugei made the arrangement, left his son with her family to allow the young people to get to know each other, which was the custom, and headed home. On the way back, he passed through a group of Tatars who were camped along the road and who invited him to eat with them. Hospitality was a fundamental value on the steppe, extended even between peoples who were technically rivals, because the road was long and you might need the same hospitality yourself one day. But the Tatars recognized Yasugai, and they poisoned the food they gave him. He made it home. He was dead within 3 or 4 days. Temujin was fetched back from Borte's family, but by the time he returned, his father was already beyond help. The clan that Yasugei had led looked at his widow, his young son and his other children, and made the calculation that steppe clans frequently made when a leader died without a strong successor ready to take his place. They left. They took their herds and their gers and their alliances, and they walked away, leaving Hoelun and her children to survive in an environment where that sentence was often equivalent to a death sentence. Hoelun did not die. This is the first thing to understand about her, and about the family she raised. She gathered her children, which included Temujin, his brothers Hasar, Hachiyun, and Temujin, his sister Temulen, and 2 half-brothers from another of Yasugei's wives, Bega and Belgutai, and she kept them alive. The family survived for years on what they could find and catch: wild onions and garlic from the riverbanks, small animals, birds, fish from the Onon River, whatever the steppe offered to people willing to look carefully and work constantly. Temujin was the eldest male in the household, which meant from the age of 9 or 10 onward, he was expected to contribute to the family's survival in real, practical terms. He learned to hunt and trap and fish, not as recreation but as daily necessity. Those years of poverty left marks on him that are visible throughout the rest of his life, even through the fragmentary and sometimes mythologized sources. He understood hunger from the inside. He understood what abandonment felt like and what it did to people's calculations about loyalty. He had grown up in a household where his father's name and position counted for nothing because the people who owed allegiance to that name had simply walked away when honoring it became inconvenient. That experience produced in him something that functioned like a permanent, carefully maintained skepticism about any loyalty that was not actively tested and reinforced. It also produced one of the most consequential acts of violence in his early life. The sources handle this episode with some discomfort. The Secret History of the Mongols is a text that admired Genghis Khan and was written in part to establish his legacy. Yet it records that Temujin, somewhere in his early teenage years, killed his half-brother Bega. The stated reason was food. Bega had taken a lark that Temujin had caught, and also a fish, and this was described as part of a pattern of taking from the younger children. Temujin and his brother Hussar approached Bega while he was sitting in the open and shot him with arrows. Bega, according to the account, did not run or beg. He sat still and asked only that they spare Belgutai, his full brother. They did. The killing of a half-brother over stolen food might seem extreme, but the context matters considerably. Food was survival. The theft was not a small insult, but an actual threat to lives already in serious jeopardy. And Temujin was establishing something about the order of authority in his family. The Secret History says Hoelan was furious. She compared her sons to wolves eating their own litter. She reminded them they had no allies, no friends, no one in the world except each other. She was right. And Temujin knew she was right, which is why the killing was not an act of carelessness. It was a choice made by someone who was already thinking about structure and power in his immediate world with unusual deliberateness. Around this same period, Temujin was captured. The Taichi Ud, a rival clan who had been among those who abandoned Yasugei's family, raided the camp and took the young man prisoner. They held him in a wooden restraint, a kang placed around the neck, a form of captivity used for prisoners of some significance. The fact that they chose capture over killing suggests they saw potential value in him. Temujin escaped. A sympathetic family within the Taichi Ud camp helped him slip away during a feast. He hid in the Onon River, submerging himself in cold water, while searchers passed along the bank. He was eventually helped to safety by the son of the man who had sheltered him, a young man named Chilon, who would later become one of Genghis Khan's generals. It is one of those details that history preserves because it illustrates something true about how Temujin operated throughout his life. People helped him, and he remembered who they were. These early years are not incidental background to the story of Genghis Khan. They are the story. He was not born with advantages. He had nothing except the experience of knowing what it felt like to be abandoned at the worst possible moment, and the particular kind of clarity about human nature that experience tends to produce in the people it does not simply destroy. The specific nature of what those years produced in him is worth dwelling on, because it shaped every subsequent decision he made. He had learned, in the most direct possible way, that formal positions of authority counted for little without the active loyalty of the people around you. His father had been a chieftain. His father's chieftainship had not saved his family from abandonment. The lesson was not abstract. Loyalty that existed only in good times was not loyalty. It was conditional alliance, and conditional alliance had a price that would eventually come due. From this lesson came his lifelong emphasis on testing and rewarding loyalty, on promoting people who demonstrated genuine commitment over people who simply claimed it, on treating betrayal as something close to the worst offense available because it was the thing that, if unchecked, would dissolve everything he was trying to build. He had also learned, in the Onon River, hiding in the cold water while his captors searched the bank above him, that survival required a particular kind of flexibility, the ability to find options that the people seeking to harm you had not considered, to go where they did not expect you to go, to do what they assumed was impossible. This flexibility translated directly into his military thinking. The feigned retreat was not simply a tactic. It was a way of using the enemy's assumptions against them, of operating in the space between what the enemy expected and what was actually happening. That capacity for thinking in terms of the gap between appearance and reality, between what something looked like and what it was actually doing, was something that the years of survival had built into him at a level deeper than conscious strategy. He was perhaps 15 or 16 years old when he finally went back to collect his promised bride. Alliances, betrayal, and a kidnapping. Dei Sechin, Borte's father, had waited. That Temujin's father had died and left the family destitute was known to him. The Temujin had survived years of hardship and had come back, alone, to honor an arrangement made when both of them were children, told the older man something worth noticing. He gave his daughter to the young man and sent them off with a gift of considerable value in their world, a coat made of black sable. Temujin took the coat and went to Togrul, the ruler of the Kerites. Togrul was one of the most powerful men on the Mongolian plateau. He and Yesugei had been sworn brothers, under in Mongol, a bond the steppe tradition treated as equivalent to kinship. Temujin presented him with the sable coat and asked for protection in memory of that old bond. Togrul accepted. He said that in memory of Yasugei, he would help reunite Temujin's scattered clansmen. This was not purely an act of sentiment. Togrul was a competent political operator who could see something worth cultivating in the young man standing before him. Not long after this, the Merkits came. The Merkits had an old score to settle. Their grievance went back to the abduction of Hoelun, Temujin's mother, which Yasugei had carried out before Temujin was born. A woman had been taken from them. By the logic of the steppe, settling that debt was not merely acceptable, but obligatory. They came in the night with 300 men and raided Temujin's camp. The family had enough warning for most of them to flee into the forest. But Borta, who was not fast enough, was taken. The Merkits did not kill her. They gave her to one of their men. The logic was symmetrical and obvious. You took our woman, we take yours. Temujin went to get her back. He assembled Togrul and called on his under Jamuka, his sworn blood brother. Jamuka was a young man of roughly the same age, from the same general region, and the bond between them was genuine. Jamuka came with his warriors. The combined force struck the Merkit camp with overwhelming speed. The camp scattered. Borta was recovered. What comes next is recorded with care in the sources. Borte gave birth to her first son approximately 9 months after her rescue. The boy was named Jochi. The question of whether Jochi was Temujin's biological son or the son of the Merkit man she had been given to was not something Temujin resolved publicly. He acknowledged Jochi as his son, raised him as such, and the matter was officially closed. What it was not, privately, was settled. The question of Jochi's parentage would haunt the family for decades, create fiction between Jochi and his half-brothers, and ultimately shape the succession crisis that fractured the empire after Temujin's death. But that is a later chapter. For a period after this, Temujin and Jamuka traveled together. They were, by all available markers, genuinely close. The secret history records them exchanging gifts at specific moments with the kind of detail that suggests a real relationship being documented rather than a diplomatic formality being noted for the record. The Anda relationship in Mongol culture was one of the most significant social bonds available. It was not entered into lightly. The two men who became Anda exchanged gifts that had physical significance and pledged a loyalty that was understood to be equivalent to, and in some respects superseding, even the loyalty of blood family. The stories of Anda who died for each other, who sacrificed personal advantage to honor the pledge, were woven through the cultural memory of the steppe world in ways that gave the bond real weight. When Temujin and Jamuka formalized their Anda relationship, they were making a public statement about the structure of their world and their obligations within it, a statement that both men's followers heard and that shaped how those followers understood their own positions. What made the eventual break between them so significant was precisely this background. It was not a betrayal in the simple sense of one person deceiving another. It was the dissolution of a bond that was supposed to be unbreakable, under the pressure of ambitions that the bond could not contain. As both men's followings grew and their relative power became more comparable, the Anda relationship transformed from an asset for both into a constraint on both. Jamuka could not fully pursue his own claim to leadership while acknowledging Temujin as his equal and sworn brother. Temujin could not fully establish his own supremacy while Jamuka remained a legitimate rival with prior claims on his loyalty. Something had to give. Then they separated. The precise reason is not entirely clear. What is clear is that after a year or two of traveling together, people began to flow toward Temujin in ways they did not flow toward Jamuka. Families, warriors. Clan leaders who had watched this young man survive things that should have killed him and had made their calculations about which direction things were heading. Jamuka noticed this too, and Jamuka, who was in many ways Temujin's equal in military ability, began to see the movement of people toward his under, not as something to be welcomed, but as a challenge to his own position. Two men who wanted the same thing were on the same steppe, and the steppe was not large enough to hold them both. The long road to unification. The years between roughly 1185 and 1206 were years of almost continuous warfare. Not the large-scale organized campaigns that came later, but the grinding, relentless kind of conflict that the steppe produced. Raids, counter-raids, shifting alliances, betrayals, reconciliations, occasional pitched battles, and the constant exhausting work of maintaining a coalition of people who had every historical reason to fight each other instead. The first major confrontation between Temujin and Jamuka came around 1187, at a battle called Dalan Baljut. Jamuka assembled a significantly larger force and won the engagement. But what he did after winning was instructive. He executed 70 captured warriors by boiling them alive in cauldrons. The brutality of this act, its pointless excess beyond what military necessity required, horrified people in his own coalition. Warriors who had fought alongside Jamuka began quietly finding their way to Temujin's camp instead. This pattern repeated across the following years. Jamuka won battles and lost supporters. Temujin lost battles and gained them. The difference was not always military ability. The difference was in how each man treated the people around him after the engagement was over. The Tatars were dealt with systematically around 1202. Temujin defeated them and issued an order that combined calculated brutality with forward-looking logic. The adult Tatar men were killed. Children young enough to be raised without memory of a separate Tatar identity were absorbed into Mongol households. It was not mercy. It was policy. An understanding that the Tatars as a source of future hostility had to be permanently dismantled, while their children, raised as Mongols, would in a generation simply be Mongols. The Karaite alliance with Togrul broke down when Togrul's son Sengum, jealous of Temujin's growing power, convinced his aging father that the young man was becoming dangerous. An attempt was made to lure Temujin into an ambush under the pretext of a marriage arrangement. Temujin received warning and escaped. The former allies went to war. Temujin won. The Karaites were absorbed. Many Karaite nobles married into Temujin's family or allied families, integrating them into the social fabric rather than simply subjugating them. The Naimans fell next. Their military capacity was broken. And finally, once again, Jamuka. Jamuka's own followers eventually betrayed him, delivering him to Temujin bound and expecting reward. Temujin had the men who betrayed Jamuka executed immediately. A man who betrayed his own lord to curry favor with an enemy was not a man who could be trusted in any future context. Then Temujin offered his old blood brother a choice. Come back to me as we were at the beginning, or die as a noble of the steppe without the shedding of your blood. Jamuka refused the first offer. He accepted the second. He said that there was room for only one sun in the sky. He was executed by having his spine broken, a form of killing that spilled no blood, reserved in Mongol custom for those of sufficient rank that their blood was not to touch the ground. It was a strange and sad ending to one of the most complicated relationships in this entire history. Two men who had pledged brotherhood as children, who had in some genuine sense known and cared for each other, who had chosen opposite sides of the most consequential conflict on the steppe of their generation, arriving at an ending that was violent and honorable and deeply sad all at once. With Jamuka's death, the plateau was unified. There was no one left to challenge Temujin's authority. The long campaign that had started when he was a teenager with nothing had arrived at something that had never quite existed before, a unified Mongol nation. It is worth pausing, before moving to the Kurultai and what followed, to think about what made Temujin different from the other leaders on the plateau who had tried and failed to achieve something similar. Because he was not unique in his ambition. Every significant chieftain on the Mongolian plateau in the 12th century wanted to be the most powerful figure on the plateau. The steppe world produced ambitious men as a natural consequence of its economic and social structure. What Temujin did that others did not was to build a system for sustaining power rather than simply accumulating it. The pattern that distinguished his approach from Jamukha's and from virtually every steppe leader who had preceded him was the combination of decisive violence with systematic generosity. He was not merciful in any naive sense. He killed people who needed to be killed by the logic of the steppe world without excessive hesitation. He destroyed tribes that had crossed lines that, in his assessment, required destruction. But he was also consistently, almost relentlessly, generous to people who came to him willingly, who served him effectively, who demonstrated the kind of loyalty that his experience had taught him to value. He remembered the names of the people who had helped him when he had nothing. He remembered the name of the family that had hidden him from the Taichi Ud. He remembered Chilaun, who had helped him escape. When he had power, he found ways to honor those debts, and the honoring of those specific debts was visible to everyone around him, which is how it became a message about what kind of patron he was going to be. He also had an unusual willingness to give genuine authority to capable people and then not second-guess them excessively. Several of his most important generals operated with significant independence. Subutai and Jabe conducted the entire western reconnaissance of 1221 to 1223, traveling through the Caucasus and the Russian steppe and the edges of Europe over the course of 3 years with 20,000 men, and sending back messages to headquarters rather than receiving continuous instructions. That level of operational independence required trust in both directions, trust by the generals that they would be supported, and trust by Genghis Khan that the generals would exercise sound judgment. The Mongol military system, with its emphasis on outcome over process and merit over birth, created the culture in which that trust was possible. The leaders produced by that culture then created the outcomes that justified the trust. None of this makes Temujin a figure from whom simple moral lessons can be extracted. The violence was real. The suffering inflicted on the people who opposed him was real, and the suffering inflicted on many who had no meaningful ability to choose was real as well. What can be said is that the particular combination of qualities he possessed, the intelligence, the memory, the patience, the willingness to learn, the capacity for both violence and loyalty, was genuinely rare, and that the rarity of the combination goes some way toward explaining why it had not happened before and why it has not happened in quite the same form since. The Kurultai of 1206. In the spring of 1206, Temujin convened a great assembly at the headwaters of the Onon River. The location was not chosen arbitrarily. This was where Temujin's family had lived in the years of their deepest poverty. This was the river he had hidden in when escaping the Taichi Ud. Coming back here to receive the formal acknowledgement of every clan leader on the plateau was a statement, though not an explicit one, about the arc of what he had built. Every significant figure in Mongol society was present. Chiefs who had fought with him for years, chiefs who had fought against him and survived, men whose tribes had been absorbed by force, and men who had joined voluntarily when they read the direction things were moving. All of them gathered at the white standard of 9 yak-tails that designated the presence of supreme authority. Here Temujin was proclaimed Genghis Khan. The title is worth pausing on. The word Khan means ruler or lord. Genghis is less linguistically transparent. One theory holds it derives from the Turkic word for ocean, and that the title means something like oceanic ruler, a ruler whose authority extends in all directions without limit, the way the ocean surrounds everything else. Another theory suggests a meaning closer to firmness or righteous strength. What is clear is what the title meant in that moment. It was a claim to authority over the Mongolian plateau as a whole, unified under a single rule for what was, in historical practice, the first time this had actually been accomplished. Genghis Khan immediately began reorganizing what he had built. The tribal system was formally replaced. The decimal organization that had worked so effectively in his army was extended to the civilian population. Every person on the plateau was assigned to a unit of 10 households, which belonged to a unit of 100, which belonged to a unit of 1,000, which belonged to a unit of 10,000. The old tribal identities did not disappear overnight, but the administrative structure above them crossed tribal lines entirely. He created a law code, the Yasa, which established rules for behavior within the Confederation, prohibited internal conflicts that had kept the steppe in perpetual instability, and provided a legal framework for disputes. The Yasa was not written down in complete form in any surviving source, and what we know comes from later accounts. But its existence and application were real, and they established something the steppe had always lacked: a set of rules that applied to everyone, enforced by a central authority with the actual capacity to enforce them. He established a personal guard, the Keshig, drawing its members from the sons of commanders across the Confederation. These sons were, in practical terms, hostages for their father's loyalty. They were also being educated in how Genghis Khan fought and governed, creating a cohort of administrators who would spread through the empire as it expanded. He was in his mid-40s. He had spent 30 years building this moment. He had no administrative tradition to draw from, no model to follow, no precedent for what he was creating. He had built it from the raw material of human ambition and human failure, learning from both with equal attention. And now he turned outward. The Yasa, the law code that was proclaimed at the Kurultai and that would govern the empire, deserves a moment of attention, even though we know it imperfectly. The sources that describe it are secondary, written by Persian and Chinese historians a generation or more after the events they describe, and there is scholarly debate about how much of what these sources attribute to the Yasa was actually established at the Kurultai of 1206 versus developed incrementally over the following years. But certain principles are consistently described and are consistent with what we can see in the empire's actual behavior. The Yasa prohibited certain categories of internal violence that had been endemic to the steppe world: killing over disputes about water and pasture, theft of animals from another clan's herds, raiding among the Mongol Confederation itself. It established obligations of hospitality that were backed by legal force rather than simply by custom. It set punishments for specific crimes, including the failure to render assistance to a traveler in need, which was treated as a serious offense. It established religious tolerance as a matter of policy, exempting clergy of all recognized religions from taxation and requiring their prayers and rituals to be respected. This last element was not an expression of philosophical pluralism. It was a practical recognition that the empire would govern people of many religious traditions, and that actively alienating the religious leadership of any of them would create problems that were unnecessary. The white standard of 9 yak tails that flew at the Kurultai, and that would fly wherever the great Khan was present for the rest of the empire's existence, was a symbol that everyone present understood. The number 9 was sacred in Mongol cosmology, associated with completeness and divine authority. The white color was associated with the sky, with the highest realm of the spirit world that the Mongol shamanistic tradition recognized. The standard was not simply a flag. It was a statement about the nature of the authority it represented, a claim that what was being established here was not merely a political arrangement, but something touched by the sacred order of things. The people who gathered on the banks of the Onon River in 1206 and looked at that standard were participating in a ceremony that was designed to be, and that was experienced as, foundational. Something new had come into the world. The Mongol nation had a center, a law, and a Khan. The war machine that changed history. The army Genghis Khan built is one of the most studied military organizations in history. Understanding it is not simply a matter of understanding why the Mongols won. It is a matter of understanding why they won so consistently, across such different terrain, against such different opponents, over such a long period of time. The decimal organization was also the military structure. The smallest unit was the Arban, 10 men who functioned as a squad in every meaningful sense. They ate together, camped together, trained together, and were collectively responsible for each other's behavior and survival. Above the Arban was the Zuun, 100 men. Then the Mingan, 1,000, which was the basic tactical unit. And then the Tumen, 10,000 men, commanded by a general who answered directly to the Khan. The critical innovation was not the structure itself, which had existed in various forms elsewhere. It was the principle governing who was assigned to which unit. Men were assigned across tribal lines. A warrior from one tribe might find himself in an arban with men from 4 different tribes. This replaced tribal loyalty with unit loyalty. The men around you were your brothers not because of shared ancestry, but because of shared experience, shared hardship, shared survival. Officers were appointed on the basis of demonstrated ability. This was radical in the medieval world. The aristocratic principle that command belonged to those born to it was embedded deeply in virtually every other major military system. Several of Genghis Khan's most important generals, men who commanded tumans and planned campaigns that would be studied for centuries, came from backgrounds that would have excluded them from any position of authority in conventionally organized armies. The Mongol horse was critical, and the approach to horses was itself an innovation. Each warrior maintained 3 or 4 horses, rotated during a campaign so that no individual animal was ridden to exhaustion. A Mongol force could cover distances in a single day that infantry armies would require a week to traverse. They could concentrate from multiple directions in a time frame that enemies planning for conventional movement found impossible to anticipate. The Mongol composite bow was one of the most technically sophisticated ranged weapons available in the medieval world. Constructed from layers of wood, bone, and sinew laminated under tension, it released arrows with force at ranges exceeding most contemporary alternatives. More importantly, it was usable from horseback at full gallop. Mongol warriors trained for years to shoot accurately while riding, releasing arrows during the brief moment in each stride when all 4 hooves were simultaneously off the ground. A skilled Mongol archer could place arrows with alarming consistency from distances that put him beyond the reach of most counter-weapons. The feigned retreat was the most famous tactic and the most consistently effective. A cavalry unit would engage an enemy, appear to take serious losses, and then turn and run. The enemy, reading this as a genuine break, would pursue. As the retreating Mongols drew the pursuing force across terrain they had already scouted, the rest of the formation closed the trap. The encirclement that followed derived from the great communal hunts in which the entire steppe population drove game into a contracting circle over days of coordinated movement. The same logic applied to human opponents. They also used speed in ways that were genuinely unprecedented. Mongol campaigns moved at rates that contemporary opponents found difficult to believe until experiencing them firsthand. By the time news of a Mongol approach had traveled to the region being attacked, the Mongols were often already there. Armies that expected weeks to mobilize their defense found they had days. The intelligence system matched the military capability. Before every major campaign, Mongol commanders gathered information through merchants, captured prisoners, and scouts who moved far in advance. They knew the terrain. They knew the political divisions among their opponents. The Mongol commander arriving at a campaign already knowing the layout of the target city and the state of its political relationships with neighboring powers was not operating on luck. He had built and maintained a system for acquiring that knowledge systematically. The psychological dimension was integral, not secondary. Before every major campaign, ambassadors arrived at the target with a standard offer stated clearly. Submit and you will be spared. Pay tribute, continue to govern your own people under Mongol oversight, and you will be part of a vast, commercially active empire. Refuse, and when the city falls, which it will, the consequences will be total. This was not always a bluff. When cities surrendered, the terms were generally honored. When cities resisted and were taken, the destruction was complete and deliberate, and it was witnessed by enough surviving refugees to carry the account forward across entire continents as a force against which resistance was not a rational calculation. The siege capability was added as the Mongols encountered fortified cities that could not be bypassed or intimidated. Genghis Khan brought Chinese and other engineers into his service and learned siege warfare as a body of technical knowledge that could be systematized and taught. Catapults, fire weapons, mining operations, water diversion. a siege capability that could reduce most medieval fortification dramatically shortened the list of cities that could hold out indefinitely. There is one more dimension of the Mongol military system that deserves particular attention, because it is the one that most commanders of the period failed to understand until it was too late. The Mongols did not simply defeat armies. They destroyed the social and political structures that could regenerate armies. When they swept through a region, the objective was not to occupy the battlefield and then stop. It was to eliminate the capacity for organized resistance, which meant eliminating the leadership that could coordinate resistance, the supply networks that could sustain it, and the morale that could motivate it. A city that submitted and survived became a city that actively supported the Mongol system through tribute and through the services it continued to provide. A city that resisted and was destroyed became a demonstration that converted the next city's council into advocates for submission without a fight. The Nurge, the great encirclement tactic adapted from hunting, deserves a fuller picture than a passing reference. When Mongol armies conducted the Nurge against a human opponent, they were doing something that required extraordinary coordination across enormous distances, and that most military systems of the period could not have organized even if they had wanted to. A Tumen would be dispatched weeks before the main campaign began to circle far around the flanks of the intended target, moving quietly, avoiding settlements where word of their passage might be sent ahead. Another Tumen would approach from a different direction. The main force would engage from the front. The encirclement would close at a designated time and signal, and what was inside the circle had no avenue of escape that had not already been covered. This is a simple concept and an extraordinarily difficult execution. It requires every unit to be in the right place at the right time, despite being separated by hundreds of kilometers and without real-time communication. The Mongols achieved it repeatedly, which says something important about the quality of planning, the quality of discipline, and the quality of intelligence that made it possible. The role of winter in Mongol strategy also deserves attention because it ran so directly against the conventional military wisdom of the period. Most armies stood down in winter. The cold, the logistics of feeding large forces when foraging was impossible, the difficulties of moving heavy equipment over frozen or muddy ground, these were compelling reasons to confine serious military activity to the warmer months. The Mongols used winter deliberately and strategically. Frozen rivers, as we will see when the Russian campaign unfolds, became highways rather than obstacles. Frozen ground bore the weight of horses and carts that would have churned soft ground into impassable mud. The cold, that was a burden for foot soldiers bundled in cloth, was far more manageable for horsemen riding small, hardy steppe horses that had been bred for exactly those conditions over thousands of years. The Mongols moved in winter when everyone else had stopped moving, which meant they arrived at their objectives when their opponents had dismissed the possibility that anyone was coming. This army, built on merit and mobility and psychological sophistication, was now pointed outward from the Mongolian plateau. The Southern Campaign, China and the Jin. The Jin dynasty had ruled northern China since the early 12th century. It was a state founded by the Jurchens, a semi-nomadic people from Manchuria who had swept down and conquered the northern portion of a once unified Chinese empire, with the Song dynasty retaining the south. By the time Genghis Khan turned his attention southward in 1211, the Jin were a settled, bureaucratic state with tens of millions of subjects, elaborate fortification systems along their northern border, and a long institutional history of managing the steppe peoples who periodically threatened them from the north. Their strategy for managing the steppe had been, for generations, to keep it fragmented. They funded conflicts between tribes, supported weaker confederations against stronger ones, conducted punitive expeditions when a particular leader became too powerful. This strategy had worked for a long time. It had contributed, in fact, to the specific conditions of division and rivalry that Temujin had grown up navigating. The Jin had conducted operations against the Mongol tribes that left a legacy of grievance. Several of Genghis Khan's predecessors had been killed by or in conflict with Jin-backed forces. When Genghis Khan turned south, he was doing so with grievances that were personal as well as strategic. The initial Jin response was to attempt negotiation. They sent ambassadors with offers of a relationship that placed the Mongols in a subordinate position, the kind of arrangement the Jin had maintained with steppe peoples for decades. Genghis Khan was not interested. Entering into such a relationship would have undermined the entire foundation of his authority on the plateau. He had spent 30 years establishing a position that answered to no one. He was not going to formalize its opposite. The Mongols crossed the Great Wall in 1211 and began what would become a campaign lasting more than 2 decades, though Genghis Khan himself would not live to see its conclusion. The Jin military was considerable. Large armies, fortified cities, experienced commanders who had generations of institutional knowledge behind them. But they were organized for a different kind of warfare than what the Mongols brought, and the North China Plain, while not open steppe, offered enough room for cavalry operations to allow the Mongols to press their advantages. The campaign did not proceed by fighting pitched battles and taking cities in sequence. It proceeded by a logic of controlled destruction designed to collapse the Jin's capacity to sustain organized resistance over time. Mongol forces moved through the countryside at speeds that local commanders could not anticipate, avoiding the most strongly held positions, destroying agricultural infrastructure, stripping the land of the resources that sustained the Jin's military capacity. Cities that surrendered were left relatively intact with Mongol-appointed administrators. Cities that resisted were taken by siege and suffered consequences proportional to the length and difficulty of the resistance. The Jin capital, Zhongdu, in the area of modern Beijing, fell in 1215 after an extended siege. When the Mongols entered the city, what they found illustrated something important about the nature of this conquest. Zhongdu was a sophisticated administrative center with skilled bureaucrats, engineers, craftsmen, and technical experts who represented centuries of accumulated institutional knowledge. Many of these people were not killed. They were evaluated, recruited, and put to work for the empire. The Khitan official Yelu Chukai, who had served the Jin court, is the most historically significant example. He became one of Genghis Khan's most influential advisors, providing guidance on how to govern sedentary populations sustainably rather than simply extracting from them until nothing was left. The distinction mattered enormously. The steppe culture from which the Mongols came had a short-term extraction logic: raid, take, move on. An empire could not function that way. An empire needed populations that produced, merchants that traded, craftsmen that made things, administrators who kept track of what was happening across vast distances. The transition from raiders to governors was not automatic or easy, but it began during the Chinese campaigns, and Yelu Chukai was one of its principal architects. The Jin emperor retreated south. The full conquest of northern China was completed under Ogedei Khan after Genghis Khan's death in 1234. But the pattern established in the early campaigns, the combination of overwhelming military force with pragmatic administration of conquered territory, was already defining what the Mongol Empire would become as it expanded further. There is a conversation recorded in the sources between Genghis Khan and Yelu Chukai that is worth pausing on, because it captures something about the nature of the transition the Mongols were making from conquerors to governors. Genghis Khan, reviewing the wealth that had been accumulated through the Chinese campaigns, reportedly asked Yelu Chukai what was to be done with the conquered territories. Yelu Chukai's response was essentially a lecture in the economics of long-term empire, that the Chinese population, if properly administered and taxed at sustainable rates, would produce more wealth over a generation than could be extracted through immediate plunder. Genghis Khan listened. This was not an obvious response from a man whose entire adult life had been organized around the logic of rapid acquisition. But he had also spent enough time building things to understand the argument for building rather than simply taking. The recruitment of Yelu Chukai was itself an example of the practice that made the Mongol Empire something more durable than a raiding culture. When the Jin capital fell, the obvious response from the steppe tradition would have been to take the portable wealth and move on. What Genghis Khan and his advisors actually did was identify the skilled people, the administrators, the engineers, the medical professionals, the scholars, and bring them into the Mongol system. This was not sentimentality. It was the same logic that drove the appointment of meritocratic military officers. You use what works, and what works is the person who knows how to do the thing you need done, regardless of where they come from. The Mongol Empire absorbed the administrative capacity of every civilization it conquered, and this absorption is one of the primary reasons it was able to govern the territory it had taken, rather than simply stripping it bare. The Jin campaign also demonstrated something about the limits of walls and fortifications against a sufficiently motivated and capable adversary. The Great Wall of China, in its 12th century form, was an impressive engineering achievement that had served as a reasonable deterrent against the relatively small raiding forces that the steppe had previously produced. Against a Mongol army of tens of thousands, organized with siege capability and moving at speeds the wall's defenders could not anticipate, it was primarily a logistical problem rather than a military one. The Mongols went through the gaps, around the ends, and in some cases directly through the wall itself when the defenders were too thin to hold the entire line. The lesson, which various civilizations have had to relearn at different times and in different forms, is that static defensive infrastructure is only as effective as the military force available to actively defend it, and that infrastructure alone does not substitute for that force. There was also the matter of the Tanguts, the people of the Xixia kingdom in what is now northwestern China. The Tanguts had been the target of Genghis Khan's first major campaign outside the plateau in 1209 and had submitted and paid tribute at that time. The relationship was uneasy throughout the subsequent years. The Tanguts were a kingdom with their own culture, their own Buddhist institutions, and their own strategic interests, and they navigated the relationship with the Mongols with varying degrees of reliability. During the Khwarezmian campaign that consumed the empire's military energies in the early 1220s, the Tanguts declined to send the military support they had promised. That refusal was not forgotten. But the Khwarezmian campaign came before the Xixia reckoning. First, there was the matter of a caravan and an insult, and what those two things set in motion. The caravan, the insult, and Khwarezm. In the years around 1218 to 1219, while the Chinese campaigns were still ongoing, Genghis Khan's attention was pulled westward by a political situation that had developed along the western edge of the Mongol sphere. The Khwarezmian Empire was one of the major powers of the Islamic world. It was ruled by Muhammad II, who carried the title of Shah, and who had spent the preceding decade aggressively expanding his territory, absorbing large portions of what is now Iran, Afghanistan, and Central Asia. From the outside, the empire appeared formidable and coherent. Internally, it was somewhat less unified than its apparent size suggested. Muhammad had complicated his relationship with the Caliph in Baghdad through political conflicts over religious authority, which meant he could not automatically draw on the full solidarity of the Islamic world in a crisis. His relationship with his mother, Turkan Khatun, was complicated by her control of her own military and political networks that sometimes operated independently of his. He had built a large empire rather faster than he had built the institutions that normally make large empires governable. Genghis Khan, by 1218, was interested in a trading relationship with the Khwarezmian Empire. The Silk Road trade routes running through Central Asia were of enormous strategic importance, and the Mongols, positioned at the eastern end of those routes, had strong reasons to want productive commercial connections with the powers controlling the western portions. A substantial trade mission was organized, several hundred merchants carrying significant wealth in goods and precious metals, traveling under Mongol authorization. The caravan arrived at the city of Otra, on the eastern frontier of Muhammad's empire, governed by a man named Inalchuk. Inalchuk had the merchants arrested and executed on charges of espionage. He kept their goods. Whether he genuinely believed the merchants were spies, or whether he simply wanted what they carried, and whether he was acting on his own initiative or with some level of sanction from Turkan Khatun's family network, is not definitively established by the sources. What is established is that he made the decision, and that it had consequences he could not have anticipated. When news of the massacre reached Genghis Khan, he sent a formal diplomatic mission to Muhammad II, 3 ambassadors carrying a demand that Inalchuk be delivered for punishment and that the merchants' goods be returned. Muhammad II's response was extraordinary in its disregard for the diplomatic conventions that both cultures nominally observed. He killed the lead ambassador, he shaved the beards of the other two, and sent them back without their colleague. The shaving of beards was one of the deepest available insults in both Mongol and Central Asian Muslim culture, a deliberate public humiliation that stripped away dignity and honor. The killing of an ambassador violated what was understood across the medieval world as a fundamental principle of diplomatic exchange. Ambassadors carried messages. They were not responsible for the messages. Their persons were understood to be inviolable. What Muhammad may have calculated, if he was calculating rather than simply acting from anger or pride, was that Genghis Khan was a distant power occupied with campaigns in China, that the Khwarezmian Empire was large enough and capable enough to absorb whatever response came from the east, and that demonstrating firmness to a steppe chieftain was the correct posture. If that was his calculation, it was one of the most consequential miscalculations in the history of the medieval world. Genghis Khan spent roughly a year preparing. The preparation was thorough and methodical. Intelligence was gathered through every available channel: merchants, diplomats, refugees from the Khwarezmian campaigns who had reason to provide information. The political divisions within the empire were carefully mapped. Muhammad's strained relationships with his own nobility and with the caliph were noted. The terrain of the campaign routes was assessed. The force assembled was divided into multiple columns designed to approach the Khwarezmian Empire from different directions simultaneously, preventing any concentration of defense at a single point. The campaign launched in 1219. The speed and coordination of the Mongol advance produced something that the Khwarezmian military system was not organized to handle. Muhammad had dispersed his forces across his empire in garrisons, which made sense as a defensive strategy against the kind of raids he was accustomed to dealing with. Against multiple large armies approaching simultaneously from different directions at speeds he could not anticipate, it made far less sense. The eastern frontier fell quickly. Ultra, where the merchants had been killed, was besieged. Inalchuk defended it for 5 months personally. When the city fell and he was brought before the Mongol commanders, he was executed by having molten silver poured into his eyes and ears. The historical record does not suggest anyone considered this disproportionate. Then the columns moved deeper. Samarkand, one of the great cities of the medieval Islamic world, a cosmopolitan center of trade, scholarship, and craft, fell after a relatively brief resistance. The population was brought outside the walls and assessed. Craftsmen, engineers, scholars, and administrators were separated and eventually transported eastward to serve the empire. The rest were left relatively intact because Samarkand had not mounted the kind of prolonged resistance that triggered the harshest Mongol response. Merv was different. Merv had been one of the largest cities in the Islamic world, a major commercial and intellectual center with a population that medieval historians estimated in the hundreds of thousands. It resisted, and when it fell, the response was total. The Persian historian Juvayni, writing a generation later, described what he found when he visited the site: a landscape of bones and ruins across terrain that had once been among the most densely inhabited in Central Asia. His specific figures were almost certainly exaggerated, as medieval casualty figures almost always are. The reality behind the exaggeration was catastrophic enough to have shaped regional memory for generations. Nishapur, another major Persian city, fell after a siege. The resistance there, which had included the killing of a Mongol general who was a son-in-law of Genghis Khan, produced a response that was deliberately total and deliberately exemplary, a demonstration used as a lesson by the armies that came after. Muhammad II did not fight a pitched battle for his empire. He may have recognized, with whatever clarity was available to him through the panic of watching his cities fall, that a direct engagement with the Mongol army was not a path to survival. So he moved from one city to another, his army dissolving around him, his empire closing behind him like water closing after a stone. Genghis Khan sent 2 generals, Jabe and Subutai, after the Shah with a detachment of 20,000 warriors. The pursuit was relentless and covered territory at speeds that Muhammad found impossible to stay ahead of. He crossed Iran. He fled to the Caspian coast. He found an island in the Caspian Sea where he could not be easily reached, and there he died in 1220 or early 1221, without an army, without a kingdom, without the dignity that had mattered so much to him the previous year. His empire, which had taken decades to build, was gone in roughly 3 years. The human cost of the Khwarezmian campaign was catastrophic. Modern historians, working carefully with the available demographic and archaeological evidence, estimate casualties in the millions across the regions directly affected. Some portions of Central Asia that had been densely populated agricultural regions did not return to pre-conquest population levels for generations. The irrigation systems that had supported agriculture in arid regions were damaged or destroyed in ways that required decades to even partially repair. The scholarly and artistic communities that had made cities like Samarkand and Merv and Nishapur into centers of Islamic learning were dispersed or eliminated. It was also the clearest possible demonstration, on the largest possible scale, of what resistance to the Mongols actually produced. The survivors of the Khwarezmian campaign who made their way westward and eastward and in every direction away from the destruction carried accounts of what had happened. These accounts were not exaggerated in the ways that medieval atrocity accounts often were, or if they were exaggerated, the reality behind the exaggerations was sufficiently catastrophic that the exaggerations added relatively little to the horror. Nishapur, which had been one of the intellectual centers of the Islamic world, a city of poets and philosophers and craftsmen, was reduced to rubble and bones. The gardens and bazaars and libraries that had made it what it was were simply gone. A traveler passing through years later described finding the site largely uninhabited, a landscape of ruins from which the life had been comprehensively extracted. Herat, which the sources describe as surrendering and then revolting and then being taken by storm, is another example of the calculus that governed Mongol policy. The first fall of Herat was accompanied by relatively lenient treatment, consistent with the pattern of rewarding cities that did not force a prolonged engagement. When the city revolted after the main Mongol force had passed through, a smaller force returned, and the treatment was harsher, in proportion to the additional cost the revolt had imposed. The logic was cold and consistent. The cost of resistance was always higher than the cost of submission, and the cost was calibrated to the difficulty of the resistance. This was not simply cruelty, though it was certainly also that. It was policy, designed to shape behavior across future decisions by populations that had heard what the policy produced. The Shah Muhammad's flight and death introduced a new element into the account, which is the personal dimension of what the Khwarezmian campaign meant for the people who had made the decisions that caused it. Muhammad II was not an unintelligent man. He had built a significant empire through a combination of military ability and political skill. But he had made two decisions, or allowed decisions to be made in his name, that demonstrated a fundamental failure to understand what he was dealing with. The first was the massacre of the merchants at Otrar. The second was the killing and humiliation of the Mongol ambassadors. Either decision alone might have been survivable. Together, they were not. He died on an island in the Caspian Sea, having watched everything he had built erased in 2 years. And the manner of his death, alone, dispossessed, without armies or advisors or the dignity of resistance, was itself a kind of message that the subsequent history of the campaign did not need to transmit explicitly. Cities and rulers far to the west heard the accounts. The accounts traveled faster than the armies and arrived before them, already doing the psychological work that the armies would later complete. The death of the World-Conqueror. Genghis Khan died in August of 1227. He was on campaign in northwestern China, conducting operations against the Xixia kingdom of the Tangut people. The Tanguts had been a recurring problem since the early years of expansion, and had, at the critical moment during the Khwarezmian campaign, declined to provide the military support they had promised. The Xixia campaign was the settling of that old account. The exact circumstances of his death are uncertain in the way that many things about his life are uncertain. Some sources describe illness that began before the campaign and worsened in the field. Others mention a fall from a horse. He was in his 60s, a substantial age for a man who had spent most of his adult life in conditions that killed most men before they reached it. He died with the campaign still underway. His death was kept secret for some time to prevent the knowledge from disrupting the military operation and to allow the succession to be managed before the news spread. His body was returned to Mongolia for burial near the Onon River. He had given instructions that he be buried in an unmarked grave without any monument. The location has never been definitively established, despite considerable modern effort involving satellite imagery and archaeological survey. Wherever he lies, it is exactly where he asked to be, nowhere that can be found and made into something larger than a man. What he left behind was an empire stretching from the Pacific coast of China to the Caspian Sea, governed by a system he had built from nothing, commanded by generals he had selected for ability rather than birth. He also left a succession arrangement that he had tried to design in advance. His third son, Ogedei, was designated as Great Khan, while his other sons received defined territories. Jochi's line would hold the western steppes. Chagatai would govern Central Asia. Tolui would hold the homeland. Ogedei would be the Great Khan over all of them. How long it would hold was another question entirely. There is something in the manner of Genghis Khan's burial instruction that deserves attention as a final piece of his character. He asked to be buried without markings, without a monument, without a tomb that could be found. This was not a casual request. For a man who had spent his entire adult life building something, who had created an institution that would outlast him by generations, who had left marks on the world that would be visible for centuries, the request to leave no visible mark on the earth at the place of his burial is striking. Various interpretations have been offered. Some historians read it as practical. An unmarked grave cannot be found by enemies who might desecrate it and cannot become a focal point for political resistance centered on his memory. Others read something more personal into it, a man who had come from nothing, who had built everything from the ground up through the application of sustained intelligence and will, perhaps did not need the reassurance of a monument. He was not a pharaoh. He was not a Roman emperor. He was the product of a world where the mark you left on the living mattered more than the mark you left on the earth, and the living were carrying his mark across a quarter of the world's surface. The empire he left was, in the truest sense, his monument. It did not require a tombstone. What the succession arrangement he had designed actually produced in practice was a period of managed tension, followed by the gradual dissolution of unified authority. The sons received their territories but did not lose their ambitions, and the ambitions of the sons' sons compounded the problem. Ogedei was confirmed as Great Khan, not immediately but at the Kurultai of 1229, 2 years after his father's death, which suggests the process of confirmation was not as straightforward as the designation had been intended to make it. Ogedei and the empire without its founder. Ogedei Khan was confirmed as Great Khan at the Kurultai of 1229, 2 years after his father's death. He was in many ways a different kind of leader from his father, and understanding the difference matters for understanding what happened to the empire during his reign and after. He was generous in the expansive way of steppe leaders, maintaining loyalty through an almost continuous flow of gifts and feasts. He was personally accessible and well-liked in a way that his father had not always been. His capacity for wine was legendary and eventually fatal. His advisors spent significant effort attempting to moderate his drinking with mixed success. He died in 1241 at the age of 55. But in the 12 years of his reign, the empire grew substantially. He established a permanent administrative capital at Karakorum in the central Mongolian steppe. What Karakorum actually looked like, at its functioning prime, was not what its status as the capital of the world's largest empire might suggest. The Flemish friar William of Rubruck, who visited in 1254, described it as smaller than a modest French village. Government buildings, warehouses, markets, residential quarters for the diverse population of officials and craftsmen and merchants who kept the empire's operations functioning. What made it significant was not its architectural grandeur, but its connectivity. Messages, goods, ambassadors, and decisions flowed through it from across the entire empire. Ogedei completed the Chinese conquest, finishing the reduction of the Jin dynasty by 1234. He organized systematic census operations to establish a foundation for regular taxation. He extended the YAM, the courier network of horse relay stations, providing the communication infrastructure that allowed the empire to function at its scale. And he authorized the Great Western Campaign. The campaign that sent Mongol armies into Russia, Poland, and Hungary was commanded by Batu Khan, Genghis Khan's grandson through Jochi, and was strategically planned by Subutai, who had conducted a reconnaissance expedition into those regions a decade earlier and who knew the terrain and the political landscape better than any other living person. The campaign began in 1237, and it proceeded with the speed and coordination that had characterized the best Mongol operations elsewhere. One aspect of Ogedei's reign that deserves more attention than it typically receives is the administrative sophistication he brought to the governance of what had previously been a purely military enterprise. Genghis Khan had built the machine. Ogedei tried to figure out how to run it as something other than a machine. The census operations he ordered across the empire's territories were not simply exercises in curiosity. They were attempts to establish the information base that systematic taxation requires: who was there, what they owned, what they could be expected to contribute on a regular basis without being destroyed in the process. The tension between the extraction logic that the Mongol military system naturally produced and the sustainability logic that long-term empire required was one that Yelu Chukai, the Khitan advisor who had moved from Jin service to Mongol service after the fall of Zhongdu, spent significant energy trying to resolve in favor of sustainability. When Mongol commanders proposed simply taxing the Chinese population as heavily as the population could bear in the short term, Yelu Chukai argued for lighter taxation sustained over longer periods, pointing out that a population taxed until it could no longer produce would eventually produce nothing. Ogedei, to his credit, was persuaded by this argument at least some of the time. The result was that the early Yuan administrative system was somewhat more sustainable than the purely extractive model would have produced, though it never fully resolved the underlying tension between a ruling class whose traditions were oriented toward raiding and a subject population whose stability required something different. The Yam courier network that Ogedei extended across the empire is worth understanding as a technological achievement in its own right. It was not simply a postal system. It was an information infrastructure that allowed the great Khan, sitting in Karakoram, to receive intelligence from the borders of China, from the frontiers of Persia, and from the edges of Europe within weeks rather than the months that information would take to travel those distances without it. The stations were spaced at intervals that kept horses fresh. The relay riders changed at each station, and the cumulative effect was that a message could travel from one end of the empire to the other at speeds that would not be equaled in most of those regions until the telegraph. Europe at the edge. The Russian principalities of the 1230s were not a unified political entity capable of coordinated defense. They were a collection of competing city-states, each governed by a prince who owed nominal allegiance to a senior prince, but who, in practice, pursued independent policies and maintained his own networks of alliance and rivalry. When the Principality of Ryazan received news of the Mongol approach in the winter of 1237 and sent to the Grand Prince of Vladimir for assistance, the Grand Prince declined to involve himself in what he apparently calculated was someone else's problem. Ryazan was destroyed in December of 1237 in a siege that lasted 6 days. The pattern that followed was consistent and terrible. Vladimir, Suzdal, Rostov, Moscow, then a relatively minor settlement, Yaroslavl. City after city besieged in winter conditions that most military traditions of the period would have considered prohibitive. The Mongols moved faster in winter than most armies could manage in summer because the frozen rivers became highways rather than obstacles, removing the barriers that normally complicated movement across the heavily forested terrain of northern Russia. They covered terrain in days that defenders expected would take weeks. The major principalities of the north were broken by the spring of 1238. The Mongols then paused, withdrew to the steppe for the summer, and returned in force in 1240. Kiev, which had been one of the great urban centers of Eastern Europe for centuries, a city of churches and markets and tens of thousands of inhabitants, was taken in December of 1240. Friar Giovanni de Pian del Carpin, traveling through the area a few years later on a diplomatic mission to the Mongol court, described what he found, a vast plain of scattered bones and empty foundations. The specific numbers he cited for the dead were almost certainly inflated. The reality was catastrophic enough. Then the campaign crossed into Poland. The experience of the Russian principalities during the Mongol campaigns of 1237 to 1240 deserves more than a list of fallen cities, because what happened there was not simply a sequence of military defeats. It was a transformation of the social and psychological landscape of a region that had, up to that point, been one of the most vibrant parts of the medieval world. Kiev in the 12th century had been a city comparable in size and sophistication to many of the great cities of Western Europe. It was a center of Orthodox Christianity, a node in the trade networks connecting Scandinavia to Byzantium through the river system of what is now Ukraine and Russia, a place of churches and monasteries and a literate administrative class that produced chronicles and correspondence and architectural innovation. The city that survived the Mongol campaign of December 1240 was a shadow of what had stood there 6 months earlier. What the Russian principalities faced in those 3 years was not simply military defeat, but the collapse of the institutional structures that made organized life possible. The monasteries that preserved the written tradition of Orthodox civilization were burned. The artisan communities that produced the distinctive Kievan metalwork and ceramics and iconographic painting were dispersed or killed. The administrative apparatus of the individual principalities, the clerks and notaries and ecclesiastical officials who maintained the records and the practices of governance, was largely destroyed. What emerged from the years after the campaign was a collection of communities that had to rebuild from a much lower base than they had started from, and that would take generations to recover the level of sophistication they had possessed in 1236. The Russian chronicle tradition of the period is full of lamentation that is genuine in a way that chronicle lamentation sometimes is not. The writers who recorded what had happened were writing about communities they had known, about churches they had prayed in, about cities their families had lived in for generations. The grief in those accounts is real, and it connects across 8 centuries to something recognizable about the experience of losing not just a battle, but a world. Poland in 1241 was a collection of duchies rather than a unified kingdom, but the various Polish princes understood well enough that what had happened to Russia was approaching their territory. Forces were assembled. The military nobility of Poland, the armored knights who were the fighting elite of medieval Central European warfare, came together under the leadership of Henry the Pious, Duke of Silesia. German Teutonic knights were present. Various allied forces added to the total. The heavy cavalry of medieval Europe was not a force to dismiss. These were men armored in ways that made individual warriors extremely difficult to kill in direct combat, trained for war from childhood, fighting in defense of their homeland. The Battle of Legnica took place on April 9, 1241. What happened there was not a simple contest of cavalry against cavalry. The Mongols used smoke to conceal their movements and positioning, creating confusion among Henry's forces about where the main threat was developing. They used the feigned retreat to draw the Polish cavalry into pursuit, separating them from their supporting infantry in exactly the way the tactic was designed to achieve. Henry himself was killed in the engagement. The Polish force was destroyed. What remained of organized military resistance in Poland dissolved. Almost simultaneously, the main Mongol force under Batu and Subutai engaged the Hungarian Royal Army at the Mohi River just 2 days after Legnica on April 11, 1241. King Bela IV had managed to concentrate his forces in a way that gave him a reasonable prospect if the Mongols engaged in conventional cavalry combat. Subutai did not engage in conventional cavalry combat. He positioned forces on multiple sides of the Hungarian camp overnight, moving through terrain that the Hungarians had not adequately screened. He led a night assault across the bridge, across the river with heavy arrow fire and catapult support that pinned the Hungarians in their camp. Then a flanking force he had sent on a wide movement upstream found a ford and crossed to threaten the camp from the opposite direction. The Hungarians, caught between forces on multiple sides, began to break. Subutai had left a gap in the encirclement deliberately, and the Hungarians who fled through it found cavalry units waiting exactly for them on the road beyond. Those who stayed in the camp were destroyed by the forces closing around them. The Hungarian army effectively ceased to exist as a military organization in a single engagement. The Mongols wintered in Hungary through 1241 and into 1242. Reconnaissance forces pushed west. The Adriatic coast was raided. Mongol scouts reached the vicinity of Vienna. Letters went to the Pope and to various European rulers. Some of those letters survive. They are notable for their matter-of-fact tone, the Mongol commanders describing the situation as if the outcome of any further campaign was simply not in question. And then came the news that Ogedei Khan had died in December of 1244. By the constitutional requirements that Genghis Khan had established, every senior Mongol commander was required to return to Mongolia for the Kurultai that would select the next great Khan. This was not optional. The legitimacy of the entire system rested on collective decision-making about leadership, and that process had to happen in person, at the right place, according to the established form. Batu and Subutai pulled their forces east. The withdrawal was ordered and deliberate. The greatest military force Europe had encountered simply went home. They did not come back. The reasons were somewhat more complex than simply the constitutional requirement. Batu had difficult relationships with several of his cousins who would be competing at the Kurultai, and organizing a renewed Western campaign would have required political cooperation from a situation that was already showing the fractures that would eventually divide the empire permanently. Subutai, who had been the strategic mind behind the entire campaign, died in 1248. And the terrain west of Hungary, dense forest and mountain ranges and stone-walled cities and shorter campaigning seasons, offered fewer of the advantages that had made the campaign through Russia and Hungary so efficient. What Europe west of the devastated frontier received was a reprieve, though in the immediate aftermath no one was entirely certain the Mongols would not return. The Pope called for a crusade. Various princes wrote alarmed letters to each other. Nothing was organized quickly enough to matter because the Mongols were already gone, and gradually the awareness settled that they were gone, and European history continued in a direction that was not Mongol. Baghdad and the death of the Islamic Golden Age. The campaign that Genghis Khan's grandson Hulagu Khan launched into the Middle East in 1253 arrived at a target that was, in a historical and cultural sense, irreplaceable in ways that battlefield losses rarely are. Baghdad had been the capital of the Abbasid Caliphate since 762 AD. In its centuries of greatness, it had been among the largest and most cosmopolitan cities in the world, the commercial and intellectual hub of Islamic civilization, a place where scholars from Persia, from the Arab world, from India, and from the older traditions of Greek learning gathered to read, debate, translate, and extend human knowledge. The library, known as the House of Wisdom, had been founded in the early 9th century and had grown into the most significant repository of texts in the medieval world. Greek philosophical and scientific works translated into Arabic, Persian, astronomical and mathematical traditions, Indian contributions to mathematics and medicine, and original work being produced by the scholars who worked there across generations. By the 13th century, the Abbasid Caliphate had lost most of its practical political power. Various sultans and regional rulers held actual military authority across the Islamic world, and the caliph in Baghdad was primarily a religious and symbolic figure rather than a military or administrative one. But he was an enormously significant symbolic figure. The caliph was understood as the legitimate successor to the prophet in an unbroken chain, the spiritual authority to whom Muslim rulers across the world paid nominal homage, the institutional embodiment of a religious tradition that extended across continents. No one had succeeded in killing a caliph in the 5 centuries the Abbasid line had existed. Hulagu Khan arrived before Baghdad in January of 1258. The caliph, al-Mustasim, had made several decisions in the preceding years that can only be described, in hindsight, as catastrophically misjudged. He had declined to send military support to the Mongol campaigns against other regional powers, missing an opportunity to establish at least some goodwill. He had dismissed reports of the Mongol advance as exaggerated. He had relied on advice that was, at minimum, not accurately representing the military situation he was facing. The siege lasted about a month. When the city fell in February of 1258, what followed was described by every historian of the period with a consistency of horror that suggests they were all responding to the same reality. The population was killed in large numbers. The city was systematically looted. The caliph was taken alive, wrapped in felt, and trampled by horses, the method of execution reserved in Mongol practice for those whose blood was not to be shed on the ground. His sons were killed as well. The Abbasid Caliphate, which had existed for 5 centuries and which embodied in its person the spiritual authority of Sunni Islam, ended in an afternoon. The House of Wisdom was destroyed. The books were thrown into the Tigris River. Persian accounts written in the generation afterward describe the river running black with ink from the pages of thousands of texts. These accounts may be somewhat exaggerated in their visual specificity. The substance of what they describe is consistent across multiple independent sources. An enormous body of accumulated human knowledge, some of it unique and some preserved in copies elsewhere, was physically destroyed. The long-term consequences on the trajectory of Islamic intellectual history are genuinely difficult to assess. The Islamic world was not destroyed by the 13th century campaigns. It recovered, produced further major contributions in mathematics, astronomy, literature, and philosophy, and was still a center of human intellectual achievement centuries later. But the destruction of the specific infrastructure that Baghdad had represented, the concentration of texts, the gathering of scholars, the institutional memory of 5 centuries of collected learning, was real and lasting, and is still mourned in the historical memory of the region. The House of Wisdom, Beit al-Hikmah in Arabic, had been founded in the early 9th century under the Abbasid Caliph Harun al-Rashid and expanded significantly under his son al-Mamun. Its essential function in its early centuries was translation, bringing into Arabic the philosophical, mathematical, and scientific works of the ancient Greek tradition, along with Persian, Indian, and other sources of knowledge that the expanding Islamic world encountered. The translation movement, as historians call it, was one of the most consequential intellectual projects in human history. It is why we know today what Euclid proved and what Aristotle argued, because the Arabic translations made in Baghdad in the 9th and 10th centuries survived in cases where the original Greek texts were lost. The works of Galen and Hippocrates in medicine, of Ptolemy in astronomy, of Archimedes in mathematics, all of these passed through the House of Wisdom, were translated, were commented upon, were extended by Islamic scholars who did not simply preserve the ancient texts, but engaged critically with them and added to them. By the time Hulagu's forces arrived at the gates of Baghdad in 1258, the House of Wisdom was not the institution it had been at its peak 4 centuries earlier. The political instability of the late Abbasid period had taken its toll, and Baghdad itself had been damaged by internal conflicts that predated the Mongol arrival. But it was still functioning. It still held texts. It still had scholars who worked within its walls. And its destruction was understood by the people of the Islamic world at the time as the loss of something that could not be replaced, because what had been lost was not simply objects, but the accumulated institutional context within which those objects had meaning. The texts that survived did so because they were held in copies elsewhere, in the libraries of Cairo, in the scholarly centers of Persia that were not destroyed or that recovered, in the Islamic intellectual community of Andalusia in Spain, which was geographically remote from the campaign and which maintained an independent tradition of scholarship. The recovery of Islamic intellectual life after the 13th century devastation was a real recovery, not simply a continuation. The scholars of the 14th and 15th centuries who built on the foundation of what remained were doing something genuinely impressive, and the contributions they made in mathematics, astronomy, and medicine in the post-Mongol period were not negligible. But they were working with less than their predecessors had had, on a foundation that had been significantly damaged, and the counterfactual of what might have been accomplished in an unbroken tradition is one of those historical what-ifs that cannot be answered but cannot be dismissed. The Mongol advance into the Islamic world stopped not far from where Baghdad falls on the map. In September of 1260, an Egyptian Mamluk force under the Sultan Baybars met a Mongol detachment at a place called Ain Jalut in what is now northern Israel and defeated it. The Mamluks were themselves a military caste of Central Asian steppe origin, and they understood Mongol tactics from something close to an insider's perspective. Baybars had studied how the Mongols fought and organized his forces to counter them specifically. The defeat at Ain Jalut was the first Mongol military loss that was not subsequently reversed, and it established the Mamluk Sultanate as the western limit of Mongol expansion. Egypt and North Africa would not follow Baghdad. Kublai Khan and the Dragon Throne. The man who completed the Mongol conquest of China and who governed the largest portion of the empire's eastern half for 3 decades was Kublai Khan, the 4th son of Tolui and the grandson of Genghis Khan. He was born in 1215, the same year the Jin capital Zhongdu fell to his grandfather's forces, and he grew up in the empire that conquest had created rather than in the steppe world that produced it. This distinction shaped everything about him. Kublai was educated in Chinese intellectual traditions. He had Chinese advisors and teachers from an early age. He absorbed the Confucian framework for governance, the conception of legitimate rule as service to the people and maintenance of order, in ways that most of his Mongol relatives had not. He was not, as his grandfather had been, a product of the steppe's survival logic and military culture. He was something genuinely new, a Mongol of the 2nd generation, shaped as much by the civilization his family had conquered as by the tradition they came from. He became Great Khan in 1260, following the death of his older brother Munka, but not without a challenge. His younger brother Arik Bok also claimed the title, and the civil war that followed lasted 4 years before Arik Bok submitted. The conflict itself was evidence that the unified succession Genghis Khan had tried to design was already breaking down. The great Kurultai had been replaced by a narrower claim, and the fact that the claim was contested by someone willing to fight rather than simply accepting the outcome indicated that the empire's political unity was under serious strain. Kublai turned to the completion of the Chinese conquest. The Song dynasty of southern China had held out against the Mongols longer than most observers had expected. The south's terrain, with its rivers, rice paddies, dense subtropical vegetation, and coastal geography, was fundamentally different from the north. It disadvantaged the cavalry mobility that had been the Mongol army's primary tactical advantage. The Song also had a functioning navy capable of fighting on the waterways that were the south's natural defensive infrastructure. Kublai's response was systematic. He built a navy, importing Korean and Chinese shipwrights to construct vessels suited to the rivers and coastal waters of the south. He developed the amphibious and riverine warfare capabilities that the terrain required. The campaign ran from the early 1270s through 1279, considerably longer than most Mongol conquests, and it involved fighting of a character different from the cavalry engagements and sieges that had characterized the earlier campaigns. The final engagement came in a naval battle off the southern coast in 1279. The last Song emperor was a child, the nominal head of a court that had been retreating before the Mongol advance for years. An official named Lu Shufu, who had remained loyal to the Song cause through the long retreat, carried the child emperor into the sea when the battle was clearly lost. He jumped overboard with him rather than allow the last representative of the Song to be taken alive. The Song dynasty ended in the water off the southern coast, with an act of loyalty that Chinese historians have recorded and remembered ever since. Kublai proclaimed himself the founder of the Yuan dynasty, placing himself deliberately in the succession of Chinese dynastic history rather than presenting his rule as the imposition of foreign conquest. This was a calculated political choice. It meant accepting the rituals and obligations of Chinese emperorship, including the Confucian legitimizing framework, while maintaining a Mongol identity at court. Chinese intellectuals of the period found the arrangement paradoxical, but it was functional enough to sustain the dynasty for nearly a century. The ambition of the Mongol project under Kublai extended beyond China. He sent a major expedition against Japan in 1274. The initial landing on the northern island of Kyushu encountered fierce resistance from the samurai defenders and was eventually pulled back, partly due to approaching weather threatening the fleet. In 1281, Kublai sent a far larger expedition, 2 fleets, approximately 4,000 ships, carrying an estimated 140,000 soldiers, converging on Japan from different directions. The Japanese defenders had spent the intervening years constructing coastal defenses and organizing their military for exactly this assault. The 2 fleets met fierce resistance at every landing point, and then, in the late summer of 1281, a typhoon struck. The storm lasted 2 days and destroyed the Mongol fleets with a completeness that left survivors numbering in the tens of thousands from a force that had numbered in the hundreds of thousands. The Japanese recorded the storm as kamikaze, divine wind, understood as a gift from heaven that had preserved the islands from conquest. The term would return to history in a very different context 7 centuries later, applied to pilots of the Second World War who chose suicide attacks in honor of the same precedent. Kublai also sent campaigns into Vietnam, Cambodia, Java, and Burma. These campaigns shared a pattern: initial military success, followed by the difficulties of sustaining large conventional armies in tropical environments against opponents willing to fight a prolonged guerrilla war rather than a pitched battle, followed by withdrawals that were framed as politically motivated rather than military failure. The Mongol Empire had limits. They were not always where you might expect them to be, and the places that survived intact did so partly because of geography and climate that reduced the Mongol military advantage from overwhelming to merely considerable. Kublai Khan died in 1294 at the age of 78, having governed the Yuan dynasty for over 30 years. He was the last of the Mongol great Khans whose authority carried any real weight across the broader empire. The successors who came after him governed China alone, in an empire that had already effectively dissolved into separate successor states. What Kublai had built in China was genuinely remarkable and genuinely contradictory. The Yuan court at Khanbaliq, which stood on the site of the modern city of Beijing, was one of the most cosmopolitan environments in the world during its period of functioning. At any given time you might find at the court Tibetan Buddhist lamas who served as spiritual advisors to the Khan, Nestorian Christian merchants from the West, Muslim astronomers from the Ilkhanate whose calendrical knowledge was valued for administrative purposes, Chinese Confucian scholars who navigated the complex politics of an imperial court that simultaneously respected and subordinated their tradition, Korean diplomats, Venetian travelers, Uyghur scribes who provided the administrative literacy that the Mongols themselves lacked, and Mongol generals who had been born on the steppe and who still lived, when they could, according to the court was, in short, a living demonstration of the empire's central paradox, that an empire built through destruction had become an environment of remarkable cultural synthesis. The administrative system of the Yuan combined Chinese bureaucratic traditions with Mongol organizational principles and resulted in something that was workable but never entirely comfortable for any of the populations it governed. Chinese scholars served in government, but they served at a disadvantage to their Mongol and Central Asian counterparts in ways that were legally codified. The paper currency system that Marco Polo found so remarkable was genuinely sophisticated, the most developed monetary system in the world at the time, but it was also subject to the kinds of inflationary pressures that paper currency without adequate restraint on issuance tends to produce, and the later Yuan period saw serious problems with monetary instability that contributed to the economic difficulties of the 1340s and 1350s. The land tax system worked, but it worked on terms that the Chinese agricultural population found burdensome in ways that added to the slow accumulation of resentment that eventually produced the rebellions of the 1350s and 1360s. Marco Polo and the world he found. In 1271, a 17-year-old Venetian named Marco Polo departed Italy with his father Niccolo and his uncle Maffeo on a journey that would keep him away from Venice for 24 years, and that would produce, eventually, a book that Europe argued about for centuries, and that shaped the imagination of at least one man who would change the map of the world. The Polo family were merchants embedded in the commercial networks connecting the Mediterranean trading world, to the overland routes leading east. Niccolo and Maffeo had already made one journey to the Mongol world, traveling as far as the court of Kublai Khan and returning with a request from the great Khan to the Pope, send scholars and priests and oil from the lamp burning at the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. The Pope was slow to respond. The scholars never came, but the Polos returned east anyway, taking Marco with them. The journey from Venice to Kublai's court took roughly 3.5 years. It went by ship to the eastern Mediterranean, then overland through what is now Turkey and Iran, through Afghanistan and over the Pamir Mountains, across Central Asia and the Gobi Desert to the Yuan capital. Marco was a young man of remarkable powers of observation, and he described everything he saw with a specificity and curiosity that set his account apart from the diplomatic reports and religious narratives that constituted most European writing about the East. What he found in Kublai's China was a world that his Venetian readers found almost impossible to believe. He described cities with populations larger than any city in Europe, served by postal and courier systems more efficient than anything in the Western world, operating with paper money that had no equivalent in the European monetary system, connected by roads maintained in better condition than most European infrastructure. He described Kublai's palace and court with an attentiveness to detail that suggested genuine first-hand observation. He described the commercial systems that moved goods across thousands of kilometers with an efficiency and scale that would not exist in Europe for centuries. He served in Kublai's administration in some capacity for roughly 17 years. The exact nature of his service is one of the questions about his account that cannot be definitively resolved. He claimed to have governed a city for 3 years. He described being sent on missions to various parts of the empire. He returned to Venice eventually, was captured in a naval war with Genoa, and while in prison dictated his experiences to a writer named Rustichello da Pisa, who shaped the material into the account that circulated across Europe under various titles. Scholars have argued about the accuracy of the account for 7 centuries. Some details have been verified against other sources and are clearly accurate. Others are disputed or hard to confirm. His failure to mention certain things that seem as though a careful observer should have noted, the Great Wall, the practice of foot binding, chopsticks, has led some historians to suggest he may have been working partly from secondary sources or compiled his account from multiple informants rather than from purely personal observation. The debate has not definitively resolved in either direction. What is clear is that the broad picture of the Mongol world that his account conveyed to European readers was substantially accurate. China under the Mongols was connected to the rest of the world in ways that had no precedent and that would not be replicated for centuries. The scale of the empire, the sophistication of its administration, the diversity of its commercial life, all of these were real, and Marco Polo's account of them, whatever its specific inaccuracies, captured something genuine about the world he had moved through. The book influenced Christopher Columbus. When Columbus sailed west in 1492, he was carrying a copy of Marco Polo's account and was, in part, trying to find a faster sea route to the world it described. The fact that the Mongol Empire had been gone from China for over a century by that point, that the Yuan had fallen and the Ming had replaced them and were restricting rather than expanding Chinese engagement with the outside world, did not factor into Columbus's plans, because the book he was using as a guide was nearly 2 centuries old and no one in Europe had fully caught up to what had changed. What Columbus found when he sailed west was not China. What he found instead set in motion a different history entirely, one that would transform the world in ways that Marco Polo's account, for all its extraordinary reach, could never have imagined. The relationship between Marco Polo's account and the subsequent history of European exploration is one of those moments where a single text, however imperfectly written and however debated its accuracy, becomes part of the causal chain of history. Columbus read the account as a document of what existed, not as a historical artifact of what had existed. He took its descriptions of Cipangu, which is Japan, and of Cathay, which is China, and of the wealth of the Eastern world, as a guide to what he would find if he could reach those places by a different route. He annotated his copy of the book extensively. His annotations survive, and they show a man who was planning, calculating, trying to correlate the distances Marco Polo described with his own estimates of the globe's size, working toward a theory of a voyage that could be made. The fact that the voyage he made in 1492 arrived not at China, but at islands in a hemisphere whose existence no European had recorded since the Norse voyages 5 centuries earlier, was, from one perspective, an error. From another perspective, it was the beginning of a new chapter of human history that no one, not Columbus, not the people who had sent him, not the people whose shores his ships reached, was fully prepared for. The Mongol Empire, by creating the conditions that produced Marco Polo's account, was one of the remote causes of that encounter. This is the kind of historical causation that operates over very long distances in both time and space, and that only becomes visible when you are standing far enough away from the specific events to see the pattern they form. The world that Marco Polo left behind when he died in Venice in 1324 was already a different world from the one he had traveled through. The plague was still 20 years away. The Yuan dynasty was still ruling China. The empire that had made his journey possible was already fragmenting, but its physical legacy in the form of the trade routes and the commercial relationships and the cultural exchanges it had created was still functioning. He died probably believing that the world he had described to his Venetian contemporaries, the world of Kublai Khan and Khanbaliq and the great empire that stretched across Eurasia, was still essentially the world that existed. He died not knowing how much had already changed, or how much more was about to. The Pax Mongolica, a world briefly connected. For roughly a generation, in the middle decades of the 14th century, the Mongol world and its successor Khanates maintained enough political stability across the Eurasian landmass to allow something historically remarkable to happen. A merchant departing the coast of Italy could travel to the Black Sea ports operated by Genoese traders in partnership with the Golden Horde, cross the steppe northward of the Caspian Sea, continue to Karakorum or Khanbaliq, and accomplish all of this under the protection of a single political authority for the substantial majority of the journey. The YAM, the Mongol courier network of horse relay stations spaced at regular intervals across the empire, provided communication infrastructure that allowed messages to travel at speeds impossible without it. A traveler in possession of the Paisa, the tablet inscribed with Mongol imperial authority, could move through the empire with protections that were genuinely enforced rather than merely nominal. What moved along these routes was the full range of things that people trade when the opportunity exists. Silk from China moved westward to the markets of Persia and eventually the Mediterranean. Spices from Southeast Asia moved through the network. Glass and finished metalwork moved eastward. Silver, which the Mongol world demanded in enormous quantities as the medium of exchange that functioned across its diverse economies, moved in both directions. Books, manuscripts, artists, craftsmen, physicians, astronomers, people moved along the routes as well as goods, sometimes voluntarily and sometimes transported at the Mongol authorities' specific direction. The technologies that traveled along these routes had consequences that took generations to become fully visible. Chinese methods of papermaking were known in the Islamic world before the Mongols and moved further westward through the Mongol commercial networks. The technique of printing with movable type, developed in China, was present in the Mongol world and eventually reached the west through channels that included these trade connections, among others. Gunpowder, a Chinese military technology since the 9th century, was known and used in the Mongol military, and its westward movement was accelerated by the trade and military connections the Pax Mongolica created. Persian astronomical techniques and the accumulated observations of centuries of Islamic astronomy moved eastward through the same channels, influencing Chinese astronomical practice at Kublai's court, where Islamic astronomers worked alongside Chinese scholars. Artistic traditions crossed enormous distances in the form of objects and traveling craftsmen who found markets across the empire. The blue and white Chinese porcelain that became a luxury throughout the Islamic world and eventually Europe carried elements of Islamic decorative tradition absorbed through the Mongol connection. It is one of the stranger truths about this period that the same empire whose military campaigns produced some of the most comprehensive destruction in medieval history also created the context for an exchange of knowledge and goods across the full width of Eurasia that had no precedent. Both things are simultaneously true, and neither cancels the other. The roads on which the merchants traveled were built over the ruins of the populations that had been killed to create the political conditions that made safe travel possible. The Pax Mongolica was built on infrastructure paid for in human lives, on a scale that the people using the roads did not always fully reckon with. But the exchange was real, and the consequences of that exchange are still visible in the world today. Consider a few specific examples that illustrate the scale and the specificity of what moved. The astronomical tables compiled at the Maraga Observatory in the Ilkhanate, established in 1259 by the astronomer Nasir al-Din al-Tusi under Kublai Khan's patronage, were among the most sophisticated astronomical instruments of the medieval world. The observatory itself was built with the explicit support of a Mongol ruler who had just destroyed the Islamic world's greatest intellectual center a year earlier, which is one of those contradictions that the period specializes in. The tables produced at Maraha were known to Chinese astronomers at Kublai's court within a few decades of their compilation. The mechanisms by which astronomical knowledge traveled from Persia to China in this period, through the commercial networks, through the movement of scholars recruited by Mongol patrons, through the deliberate policy of Kublai Khan, who brought Islamic astronomers to work alongside Chinese ones at his court, are traceable in the historical record. This is not speculation about what might have moved. This is documented knowledge transfer. The technique of making distilled spirits, aqua vitae as it was called in the Latin-speaking world, may have moved through the Mongol trade network in the 13th or 14th century, though the exact pathway is debated. The distillation of alcohol from fermented grain and grape had been practiced in various forms in various places. But the spread of the technique across Eurasia in the period of the Pax Mongolica and its immediate aftermath is connected by some historians to the commercial and technological exchanges that the network facilitated. Whether or not this specific example holds up under the closest scrutiny, it illustrates the kind of technological diffusion that was happening across the network during this period. The cotton plant, the cultivation of which was established across Central Asia before the Mongol period, was encountered by European travelers in the Mongol world and contributed to the gradual spread of cotton cultivation and cotton textile production into Mediterranean Europe in the 13th and 14th centuries. The paper money and credit instruments that functioned across the Mongol commercial network introduced European merchants who interacted with the system, primarily through the Black Sea trading ports, to financial instruments that had no equivalent in their own commercial tradition, and that contributed to the development of European commercial banking over the following centuries. None of these individual examples is a story that can be told cleanly, with a clear origin, a clear transmission route, and a clear destination. Cultural and technological diffusion never works that cleanly. But the aggregate picture of a period in which the Eurasian landmass was more deeply interconnected than it had been before and would be again for several centuries is real and historically significant in ways that the contemporary horror of the conquests that created it can sometimes obscure. The people who actually lived and worked within the Pax Mongolica experienced it not as a historical phenomenon, but as the texture of their daily commercial and intellectual lives. A physician in Tabriz might receive a patient who had traveled from as far east as the Ganges Delta, carrying with him herbs and practices from the Ayurvedic tradition that the Tabriz physician had never encountered. A poet in Samarkand might hear through the networks of scholars and travelers who passed through the city of a poetic tradition from the Chinese East that used formal conventions entirely different from those of the Persian tradition in which he had been trained. A merchant in Caffa on the Black Sea might find himself in commercial conversation with a partner whose goods had originated 5,000 kilometers away and whose language required the services of 3 successive interpreters to bridge the distance between them. These encounters were not abstractions. They were the fabric of life in the Pax Mongolica, and they left deposits in the civilizations that experienced them, that accumulated over decades into the broader shifts we can see in retrospect. The Pax Mongolica ended not with a single event, but with the accumulation of disasters and political fractures that characterized the second half of the 14th century. The plague, the collapse of the Yuan, the dissolution of the Il Khanate, the fragmentation of the Chagatai Khanate, the progressive weakening of the Golden Horde. Each of these removed a piece of the infrastructure that had made the connected world possible, and by the 1370s and 1380s, the world that Marco Polo had described was already largely a memory rather than a present reality. The roots still existed. The cities still stood, those that had not been destroyed. But the political framework that had made them safe for long-distance travel was gone, and the next century and a half of Eurasian history would be characterized by the kind of fragmentation and local conflict that made the Pax Mongolica, in retrospect, look like an extraordinary and unrepeatable interlude. The Dark Road, plague and the trade network. The bacterium Yersinia pestis, which causes bubonic plague, had existed in the rodent populations of Central Asia for a very long time before the 14th century. It maintained a slow, persistent cycle through marmot and rat populations across the steppe and mountain regions, producing occasional local outbreaks when it crossed into human communities through flea bites. These outbreaks were serious but contained, unable to travel quickly enough through the sparse populations of the region to become large-scale epidemics. What the Mongol trade network created was a radically different set of conditions. The Silk Road was a complex network of routes connecting the major population centers and commercial hubs of the Eurasian landmass, from the Pacific coast of China to the Mediterranean ports. Along these routes, caravans moved at regular intervals, carrying goods between markets. The caravans were large, often hundreds of animals and dozens of people, and they traveled through terrain where plague-carrying rodents were endemic. The settled stopping points along the routes, the caravanserais, the oasis cities, the harbor towns, were exactly the environments where rat populations concentrated around human food supplies, creating the conditions in which fleas carrying the plague bacterium most readily encountered humans. In the late 1330s and early 1340s, the plague appears to have broken out in Central Asia with unusual severity. Recent research published in the 2020s has identified cemeteries in what is now Kyrgyzstan, near the shores of Lake Issyk-Kul, with burial rates significantly above normal for the years 1339 and 1339, and with inscriptions on tombstones that in a few cases specifically mention pestilence. This evidence points toward the southern Chagatai Khanate territory as an early center of the outbreak, though the full picture is still being researched and debated. What is clear is that the outbreak spread along the trade routes with an efficiency that the Silk Road network itself had created. By the mid-1340s, the plague had moved through Central Asia and into the territory of the Golden Horde in the western steppe. In 1346, the Golden Horde was besieging Caffa, a Genoese trading city on the Crimean Peninsula projecting into the northern Black Sea. Caffa was one of the critical nodes in the commercial network connecting the Mongol interior to the Mediterranean trading world. The siege was an expression of periodic tension between the horde and the Genoese merchants who operated in its territory. During the siege, the plague broke out in the Mongol camp. Gabriele de Mussi, a Genoese notary who wrote an account of the plague's spread, described what happened. The Mongol army, its forces decimated by the disease, used catapults to throw the bodies of those who had died over the walls of Caffa, hoping to spread the infection among the defenders. The Genoese threw the bodies into the sea as fast as they could, but the infection had already taken hold. The Genoese ships that left Caffa carried the plague with them. Whether this account is precisely accurate in all its details, whether the catapulted corpses were specifically responsible for bringing the plague into Caffa, or whether it entered through other channels related to the siege conditions, historians have debated. What is not debated is what the ships that left Caffa carried. They stopped at Constantinople, where the plague entered one of the largest cities in the medieval world. They continued to Messina in Sicily. They reached Genoa and Venice and Marseille, and at every port they entered, the plague came ashore. Within weeks of arriving in a city, the disease was moving through neighborhoods at a pace that contemporary people had no framework to understand or resist. It killed in ways that seemed random and unstoppable. The buboes, the swollen lymph nodes in the groin, armpit, and neck that gave the disease its common name, appeared within days of infection and were almost universally fatal in the forms that struck 14th century Europe. The pneumonic form, which spread through the air from person to person, was even more lethal and even faster. Physicians had no effective treatment. The Church had no explanation that satisfied anyone standing in the middle of it. The plague moved through the Mediterranean coastline in 1347 and 1348, killing with a consistency that left survivors struggling to bury the dead. The best current estimates suggest that between a third and half of Europe's population died in the first great wave of the plague, roughly between 1347 and 1352. In some specific cities and regions, the mortality was higher. Florence may have lost between 60 and 80% of its population. Certain rural areas suffered even worse mortality because, without enough survivors to maintain agricultural production, famine followed disease. In England, between a third and a half of the population died. In France, similar proportions. The scale of death had no precedent in European recorded history. The consequences extended far beyond the immediate mortality. Agricultural land was depopulated, and the labor scarcity that followed gave surviving peasants bargaining power they had never possessed before. The rigid social structures of medieval feudalism began to show cracks that would continue to widen over the following generations. The Church, which had failed to explain the plague or to provide any effective comfort against it, lost some of the moral authority it had held. The intellectual frameworks for understanding human experience that had seemed stable for centuries were thrown into question by an event that no existing framework could encompass. The Mongol armies had not sent the plague deliberately. The concept of infectious disease transmission through organisms too small to see did not exist in any civilization's understanding in the 1340s. Germ theory would not arrive for another 5 centuries. What the Mongols had built, the most extensive long-distance commercial network that had ever existed, was also the most efficient distribution system that had ever existed for anything capable of traveling along it. The plague was one of the things that traveled. The breaking apart, 4 worlds from one. By the time the Black Death was spreading through Europe, the Mongol Empire as a unified political entity had already been dissolving for a generation. The fractures had begun almost immediately after Genghis Khan's death in 1227, had been managed under Ogedei, had deepened under the disputed successions that followed, and by the 1260s had become permanent divisions that no political process could bridge. The conflict between Kublai Khan and his brother Arik Bok, which we have already noted, was one expression of the fundamental problem. The great Kurultai, the collective decision-making assembly that had legitimized every great Khan since Genghis Khan himself, could only function as a legitimizing institution if the various branches of the royal family were willing to accept its outcome. Once one claimant was prepared to fight rather than submit, the institution broke down. After Kublai's victory over Arik Boka, no subsequent Khan was recognized by all branches of the family simultaneously. There were also armed conflicts between the Ilkhanate and the Golden Horde over disputed territories in the Caucasus, meaning that 2 of the 4 successor Khanates were actively at war with each other. The empire had 4 major portions, each going its own direction, connected by a shared heritage and by the trade routes that ran between them, but governed independently and increasingly in competition. The Yuan dynasty in China was in many ways the most sophisticated of the 4, the most administratively complex, governing the largest settled population. But it governed that population as a foreign dynasty, which created a particular kind of structural vulnerability. The Mongols maintained their ethnic identity under the Yuan, occupying the top tier of a social hierarchy that ranked Mongols above Central Asians, above Northern Chinese, above Southern Chinese. Chinese scholars who had spent their lives preparing for the traditional government examinations found the examinations restricted or suspended, their path to official positions blocked by a system that privileged Mongol and Central Asian candidates regardless of their preparation or ability. The resentment this produced was real and sustained, and it was compounded in the 1340s and 1350s by a combination of natural disasters, flooding, famine, and plague that the Yuan government could not manage effectively. The Red Turban Rebellion gathered force through the late 1350s and 1360s, drawing together diverse strands of Chinese religious and social discontent under a charismatic leader named Zhu Yuanzhang. Zhu was not a nobleman. He was the son of poor tenant farmers, orphaned young, who had survived a famine by becoming a wandering Buddhist monk and had eventually found his way into the rebellion as a soldier and then a commander. His ascent from absolute poverty to the head of a successful rebellion against the world's largest empire is one of the more remarkable individual trajectories in Chinese history. In 1368, his forces took the Yuan capital. The last Yuan emperor fled north into Mongolia with little resistance. The Ming dynasty was established. China had been under Mongol rule for less than a century. The Ilkhanate in the Middle East went through a different trajectory. Kublai Khan's successors converted to Islam in 1295 under the Ilkhan Ghazan, in a move that was simultaneously a genuine religious conversion and a political calculation about legitimacy in a majority Muslim territory. The conversion marked the formal end of the Ilkhanate as a pagan or Buddhist steppe regime, and the beginning of its transformation into a Muslim Persian dynasty that happened to have Mongol origins. After Ghazan, the Ilkhanate went through a rapid succession of short-lived rulers, sustained civil conflict, and progressive fragmentation of authority. The plague struck the Ilkhanate severely in the late 1340s, disrupting administrative structures that had been struggling anyway. By the 1330s, the Ilkhanate had dissolved into smaller successor states, none of which claimed or could claim the authority that Hulagu's original polity had exercised. In Central Asia, the Chagatai Khanate was the most persistently unstable of the four successor states. It never achieved the kind of settled governance that the Yuan managed, even temporarily, or the administrative coherence that the Ilkhanate displayed in its better periods. It spent most of its existence in civil conflict, divided between western and eastern portions, contested by rival claimants, its territory a zone of instability that produced capable fighters, but never produced a state capable of sustaining itself long term. It fragmented gradually through the latter half of the 14th century. Its most significant contribution to subsequent history was as the claimed heritage of Timur, known in the Western historical tradition as Tamerlane. Timur was born in 1336 in the Chagatai territory and built his power through a combination of military genius and ruthless political operation. He claimed Mongol lineage, though he was primarily of Turkic origin, and he framed his campaigns as a restoration of Mongol glory. He swept through the region from the 1370s through the early 1400s, conducting campaigns through Persia, Iraq, India, Anatolia, and the Russian steppe. He defeated the Ottoman Turks at the Battle of Ankara in 1402. He died in 1405 on his way to campaign against China. The pyramids of skulls that Timur's forces constructed outside conquered cities became one of the most distinctive and disturbing images of his campaigns in the historical memory of the regions he passed through. His legacy was deeply ambiguous. Even in his own time, he was a genuine patron of architecture and arts who built magnificent structures in Samarkand, while simultaneously leaving trails of destruction behind his campaigns that rivaled the original Mongol conquests. He is still a complex figure in the historical memory of Central Asia, celebrated in some traditions and condemned in others, which is a consistent feature of figures whose power operated at his scale. The Golden Horde, ruling the northern steppes and maintaining dominance over the Russian principalities, lasted longer than any of the other successor states and declined more gradually. For 2.5 centuries after the initial conquest, Russian princes made the journey to the Horde's capital on the lower Volga to receive confirmation of their positions. They paid tribute regularly and accepted the oversight of Mongol authority over their external affairs. The relationship was not one of total subjugation in all dimensions. Russian cultural and religious life continued largely undisturbed. The Orthodox Church maintained its institutions and was actually granted tax exemptions by the Mongol authorities. Russian princes built their cities, expanded their territories in competition with each other, and administered their populations using governance traditions that were primarily their own. But the horde took tribute, and its military power remained real enough to remind Russian rulers of the consequences of non-payment. The relationship shaped Russian political culture in ways that scholars have been debating for centuries. The extent to which elements of Mongol administrative practice, postal systems, census methods, and military organization influenced the development of the Russian state as it consolidated in the 14th and 15th centuries is a question that does not have a clean answer, but that shapes how historians understand early Russian statecraft and political culture. The first significant Russian military victory over the horde came in September of 1380. The Grand Prince of Moscow, Dmitry Ivanovich, who would afterward be called Donskoy for the river near which the battle was fought, led a coalition of Russian forces to the Kulikovo field on the Upper Don and engaged a horde army under the military leader Mamai. The battle was hard fought and for a long time uncertain. The Russian forces won. Mamai retreated and was eventually killed by rivals within the horde's own political structure. The victory at Kulikovo field did not end Mongol power in Russia immediately. The horde's Khan Toktamish sacked Moscow 2 years later in 1382, exacting tribute and demonstrating that the horde remained militarily capable. But Kulikovo field had broken something psychological. The assumption that Mongol forces could not be defeated by Russian armies in the field had been shattered, and the change in the realm of the possible mattered as much as the military result itself. Something had shifted in how Russian princes thought about their situation and their prospects. The formal end came in 1480. Ivan III of Moscow, who had spent his reign consolidating Russian political authority and expanding Muscovite control over neighboring principalities, simply refused to pay tribute when it came due. The horde's Khan Ahmad assembled a force and moved toward the Russian border. The two armies faced each other across the Ugra River through the autumn of 1480 in a standoff that neither side converted into an engagement. Winter came. Ahmad withdrew. He was killed in 1481 by rival steppe powers. The horde fragmented over the following decades into smaller successor khanates, all of which were eventually absorbed by the expanding Russian state across the 16th and 17th centuries. The Mongol presence in Russia had lasted roughly 240 years. What it left behind in terms of vocabulary, administrative practice, cultural influence, and the shape of political institutions is something that Russian historians have debated for centuries and continue to debate, and that Russian historical memory processes in complicated ways that are still visible today. The debate about the Mongol influence on Russian development has been one of the most persistent and politically charged questions in Russian historiography. One school of thought, associated particularly with the Eurasianist intellectual tradition of the 19th and 20th centuries, argued that the Mongol period was formative for Russian political culture in ways that were not entirely negative, that the administrative and organizational techniques the Russians absorbed from the horde, the postal system, the census methodology, the military organization, contributed to the eventual emergence of the muscular centralized Russian state that expanded across Eurasia in the 16th and 17th centuries. The other school argued that the Mongol period was primarily a catastrophe and an interruption, that the devastation of the initial conquest and the subsequent tribute relationships retarded Russian economic and social development and contributed to the authoritarianism that characterized Russian governance for centuries afterward. Both positions contain enough truth to have sustained the debate for this long, and neither position contains the whole truth. The Russian state that emerged from the period of Mongol dominance was, by the 16th century, genuinely different from the loose collection of competing principalities that had existed before 1237. Whether those differences were primarily caused by the Mongol experience, or whether they reflected trends in Russian development that would have occurred without it, or some combination, this is exactly the kind of historical question that cannot be answered with certainty and that continues to produce excellent scholarship. What is clear is that the Mongol period is embedded in the Russian historical identity in ways that the subsequent centuries have not fully processed. The phrase Mongol-Tatar yoke, which emerged in Russian historical writing of the 15th century and which became standard in the historiography of subsequent periods, encodes a particular interpretation of those 2.5 centuries that emphasizes external domination and interrupted development. That interpretation has political uses, and it has been used politically by Russian writers and rulers from the 15th century forward to explain certain features of Russian society and governance as the consequence of an external imposition rather than indigenous development. The conversation about what those 240 years actually meant for the territories that experienced them is one that has not reached a settled conclusion. Timur's campaigns of the late 14th and early 15th centuries, which we mentioned briefly in the context of the Chagatai Khanate, deserve a slightly fuller treatment because of the specific effects they had on the territories that were trying to recover from the first wave of Mongol conquest. Timur struck the Golden Horde in 1395, defeating its Khan Toktamish and sacking Sarai, the Horde's capital. This blow, coming on top of the Horde's defeat at Kulikovo Field 15 years earlier, was one of the decisive factors in the Horde's progressive collapse over the following decades. In that sense, Timur's campaign contributed to the eventual liberation of the Russian principalities from Mongol tribute, which is an irony. A man claiming the Mongol heritage, conducting campaigns in the name of Mongol restoration, delivered one of the decisive blows to the institution that had been the most lasting expression of Mongol power in the West. History's ironies are rarely subtle, but they are occasionally this direct. What the storm left behind. The question of what the Mongol Empire was and what it left behind does not resolve into simple answers, and any account of it that tries to make it simple is being dishonest in one direction or the other. Start with the destruction, because honesty requires starting there. The death toll from the Mongol conquests is one of the most contested numbers in historical demography. Contemporary accounts written by survivors or near contemporaries of the campaigns describe casualties on a scale that their own readers sometimes doubted, and that modern historians have spent considerable effort trying to assess against available evidence. Population figures from before and after the campaigns, archaeological evidence of site abandonment and rebuilding, and careful analysis of agricultural and administrative records all contribute to estimates that are more carefully constructed than the medieval figures, but still involve significant uncertainty. The range in the scholarly literature runs roughly from 20 to 40 million people killed as a result of the Mongol conquest directly and indirectly, including those killed in military action, those who died in famines resulting from agricultural disruption, and those who died in the epidemic of plague that traveled along the trade networks the empire created. In a world population of approximately 400 million people at the time, even the lower end of that range represents 5% of all human beings alive. In specific regions, the losses were proportionally far higher than those averages suggest. Parts of Central Asia that had been densely populated agricultural regions in the early 13th century remained sparsely populated 2 centuries later. Northeastern China lost a substantial fraction of its population in the campaigns of the 1210s through 1230s. The demographic recovery of the most severely affected regions was measured in generations, not decades. The destruction of the Abbasid intellectual infrastructure in Baghdad represents a loss of a different kind, less quantifiable in terms of raw mortality, but historically significant in ways that continue to be debated. The House of Wisdom was the product of centuries of systematic collection and translation and original scholarship. What was destroyed in 1258 was not simply a building full of books. It was an institution that had accumulated a particular kind of collective knowledge, relationships between scholars, traditions of inquiry, annotated copies of texts that carried centuries of commentary, an institutional memory for what had been learned and what questions remained open. Some portion of what the House of Wisdom contained survived in copies held elsewhere. The tradition of Islamic scholarship recovered and produced remarkable work in the centuries that followed. But the specific infrastructure that Baghdad had represented was gone, and the counterfactual of what might have been accomplished without the interruption is genuinely unknowable. And yet, the same network that enabled the plague's spread also enabled the most extensive cultural exchange in pre-modern history. This is not a way of offsetting the destruction. It is simply an additional fact that exists alongside the destruction and demands acknowledgement if we are going to be accurate. Chinese papermaking technology moved westward through the Mongol world. The paper on which the European printing revolution of the 15th century was accomplished arrived in Europe through channels that included the Mongol trade networks in their contribution. Gunpowder weapons, which transformed European warfare and eventually European history in ways that took centuries to fully play out, moved westward through those same channels. Mathematical techniques, astronomical knowledge, medical practices, agricultural methods, all of these moved across the Pax Mongolica in ways that left marks on the civilizations that received them. The horse, as an animal, is perhaps the most consequential of the Mongol exports that operated at a remove from any deliberate intention. The horses, introduced to the Americas by the Spanish in the late 15th and early 16th centuries, were ultimately connected to the great Eurasian horse culture of the steppe world that the Mongols both expressed and accelerated. When those horses were acquired by the indigenous peoples of the North American Great Plains in the 17th and 18th centuries through trade and theft from Spanish settlements, they created entirely new cultures and ways of life among peoples who had never had horses before. The great buffalo hunting cultures of the Comanche, the Sioux, the Cheyenne, the Crow, and many other plains peoples were built around horses. And those horses came from a tradition of horsemanship whose Mongol expression had, centuries earlier, helped carry it into the Americas through the Spanish intermediary. The Mongol Empire was not the only link in that chain, but it was a link. The genetic legacy is one of the most striking aspects of the Mongol inheritance because it is measurable in a way that most historical legacies are not. In 2003, a research team led by Chris Tyler Smith published a study in the American Journal of Human Genetics identifying a specific Y chromosome haplotype carried by approximately 8% of men across a broad belt of territory from Central Asia to the Pacific, representing roughly 16 million men at the time of the study. The pattern's distribution, concentrated in and around the territory of the former Mongol Empire and following the movement patterns of Mongol armies and settlement, strongly suggests that it derives from a single ancestor, or a small group of closely related men living in Mongolia approximately 1,000 years ago. The statistical case for identifying this genetic ancestor as Genghis Khan himself, or members of his direct patrilineal family, is strong. It is not provable in the strict logical sense, and scholarship continues to refine the picture. What it tells us is that whoever the men were who carried this lineage, their reproductive success was on a scale without parallel in the documented genetic history of our species. Approximately 1 in 200 men alive on Earth today carries a direct patrilineal connection to whoever left this mark on the human genome. The modern nation of Mongolia carries Genghis Khan in its national identity with a complexity that reflects the genuine ambiguity of the inheritance. During the Soviet period, when Mongolia functioned effectively as a satellite of the USSR, any positive public mention of Genghis Khan was discouraged or suppressed, because Soviet ideology saw Mongolian national pride centered on a world-conquering figure as a threat to the internationalist identity the regime preferred. Efforts to commemorate his birthplace in 1962, the 800th anniversary of his birth, received political condemnation from Moscow. After Mongolian independence in the early 1990s, Genghis Khan was restored to public honor with considerable enthusiasm. He is now on the currency. The main airport in Ulaanbaatar bears his name. The main square in the capital is named for him. He occupies in Mongolian national identity the role that founding figures occupy in other national identities, essential, honored, and not always fully reckoned with in all dimensions. In the countries that experienced the conquest, the relationship with that inheritance is understandably more complicated. In Iran and Iraq, the destruction of the 13th century is part of a historical memory that shapes how people think about invasion and foreign domination and the vulnerability of civilization to catastrophic force. In China, the Yuan is one of the accepted dynastic periods in the standard historical narrative, studied and analyzed but not celebrated, an episode that the civilization absorbed and moved past. In Russia, the phrase Mongol Tatar yoke carries centuries of political weight, contributing to how Russia has understood its relationship with its eastern neighbors and its own place between European and Asian civilization. The Mongol Empire teaches, if it teaches anything, something about the scale and unpredictability of historical consequence. The empire came from a specific place, was produced by a specific set of conditions, was built by a specific person with a specific set of qualities, and changed the world in ways that were not intended, not fully foreseen, and that have not entirely resolved themselves even now. The roads built for military conquest were the roads along which silk and ideas and craftsmen and plague traveled. The destruction of the Islamic world's great centers of learning happened at the same time and under the same political authority that created the most extensive cross-cultural exchange the medieval world had yet seen. The same empire that killed tens of millions of people also created the conditions in which 16 million men living today carry its genetic legacy. History does not resolve into lessons, it resolves into more history, into consequences that breed further consequences across time scales longer than any individual human life, into a present that is, in ways we can trace and ways we cannot, built on foundations laid in the felt tents and on the frozen rivers and in the burning libraries of 8 centuries ago. There is a specific kind of humility that the Mongol history tends to produce in people who sit with it long enough. It is the humility of understanding that the scale of historical consequence is not proportional to the intention of the actors, and that the actors with the most dramatic consequences are not necessarily the ones with the most developed understanding of what they are doing. Genghis Khan did not know that his trade network would carry a plague that would kill a third of Europe. He did not know that the engineers and scholars he recruited from conquered cities would transmit knowledge that would eventually contribute to a European printing revolution. He did not know that the genetic material he left in the populations of the territories he swept through would be measurable in the bodies of 16 million men 7 centuries later. He was thinking about the next campaign, the next alliance, the next problem in the management of an entity he was building on the fly with no precedent and no roadmap. The fact that the consequences extended so far beyond anything he could have intended is not a reason to credit him with those consequences. It is a reason to be thoughtful about how we assign credit and blame in historical narratives, and about the limits of human agency when the systems that individuals set in motion acquire their own momentum. Consider the Silk Road in the Pax Mongolica period from the perspective of someone actually living it. An astronomer in Isfahan who receives news that Islamic astronomical tables have been requested by the court of the Yuan Emperor in Khanbaliq. A craftsman in Samarkand who finds buyers for his silk goods among merchants who have come from further east than any previously encountered in his city. A merchant in Venice who is hearing accounts of a world to the east so vast and so wealthy that it strains the credibility of anyone not carrying first-hand testimony. These people are not experiencing the Pax Mongolica as a historical phenomenon. They are experiencing it as a fact of their daily commercial and intellectual lives. And the decisions they make on the basis of those experiences, the routes they travel, the knowledge they transmit, the goods they carry, are the actual mechanism through which the consequences of the Mongol Empire extend into the future. The Black Death operates the same way, but in reverse. No one on the ships leaving Caffa in 1347 knew what they were carrying. The sailors, the merchants, the passengers were going home or going about their business. The thing that traveled with them was invisible to them and would remain invisible to any human being for another 5 centuries. The consequences of what those ships carried were experienced by the people of medieval Europe as an act of God, as divine punishment, as the end of a world they had believed was stable and governed by comprehensible principles. It was none of those things. It was a bacterium riding a flea on a rat in the hold of a ship that happened to call at Caffa during a siege, and then kept calling at ports all the way to the English Channel. The randomness of this, the absence of intention, the gap between cause and effect that stretched across thousands of kilometers and decades of time, is one of the most important things to hold on to when thinking about the Mongol Empire and its legacy. The empire was built intentionally through the application of human intelligence and human will across decades of sustained effort. Its consequences were not built intentionally. They emerged from the system the empire created, operating according to logics that no one fully understood or controlled. That is true of most large historical phenomena, But it is particularly visible in the Mongol case because the scale is large enough and the consequences diverse enough to make the gap between intention and outcome impossible to miss. The rider who changed the world. The story we have followed tonight started on the banks of the Onon River in 1162 with a child who was expected to amount to nothing, holding a blood clot in his right fist. That child survived a childhood that killed his father and should have killed him. He survived poverty that lasted years and produced a clarity about human nature that most people are fortunate enough never to acquire through such direct means. He survived capture and enslavement, and the particular loneliness of being the eldest male in a destitute family with no protectors and no prospects, in a world that had made clear it had no particular interest in whether he lived or died. He built alliances one at a time, starting from nothing, and he never stopped building them. He understood something about how loyalty worked and how power accumulated that the people around him, including people with far greater advantages, failed to understand with the same precision. He was patient when patience was required, and decisive when the moment called for action, and he knew the difference between those moments in a way that most people do not. He built an institution, an army, and an administrative system on principles of merit and coordination that were genuinely ahead of their time and that outperformed every alternative they encountered over the course of decades of continuous conflict. And then he died on campaign in northwestern China in August of 1227, and the thing he had built continued without him for another century and a half, in 4 pieces that gradually went their own separate ways, in 4 different directions that reflected the different civilizations they had been built into and among. The world that existed when those pieces finally dissolved was in fundamental respects different from the world that had existed when he was born. The trade routes were different. The political map of Asia was different. The demographic reality of Central Asia, Persia, China, and Russia was different. The distribution of technologies and ideas and diseases had altered the trajectories of civilizations that Genghis Khan had never personally touched and had almost certainly never thought about. He did not set out to change history in the abstract sense. He set out to survive and then to dominate his immediate world, and then, when the logic of dominance required it, to expand that world until it had no available edges. The transformation of those personal ambitions into global consequences was the work of the machine he built, operating according to its own internal logic long after his death, beyond anything that could be fully intended or foreseen by the man who set it in motion. The felt walls of the Gur on the Mongolian steppe are thick enough to hold out most of the cold. The horseherd stands quiet in the dark outside. The Onon River still runs where it has always run, northeast through the Kurultai mountains, carrying the same water it carried in 1162, past the place where a child was born clutching something in his fist that the people around him read as a sign. They were not wrong. They had no way of knowing how large the sign actually was. If you have stayed with me through all of this, thank you for being here. History told at this pace, in this kind of quiet, is not meant to be efficient. It is not meant to transfer information the way a textbook does. It is meant to do something slower and harder to name, to let the weight of the past settle into the present for a little while, to remind us that the world we inhabit is not the original version of the world, that it has been shaped by people who are long gone and by events that are long over, in ways that extend further than we can usually see from where we are standing. The Mongol Empire is gone. The steppe is still there. The wind still comes from the north without much warning. And somewhere in the genetic record of roughly 1 in 200 men currently alive on Earth is a connection, invisible but real, to a boy born on a river in northeastern Mongolia who decided, against all available evidence, that the world was going to be different. Let your breathing slow. Let the story settle. The empire is gone. The grass remains. The river keeps running. Good night.